Somewhere in the dark, on a soft yellow bluff above a wide, slow river, there is a small oil lamp burning in a doorway, and that is where we are going to begin tonight. The lamp is nothing much at all. It is a shallow clay dish with a little animal fat pooled in the bottom of it, and a twist of hemp fibre laid in for a wick, and it gives off a low amber light about the size of an apricot, and a thin grey thread of smoke that leans whichever way the night air leans. The doorway it stands in belongs to a house dug half into the hillside, its walls made of packed yellow earth, its roof made of millet stalks bound down flat against the wind. On that roof millet is drying, small hard golden grains spread out in a thin patient layer, cooling from the day's sun, giving off a faint dusty sweetness, rather like the inside of an old grain sack. There is a hoe leaning against the wall by the door, its wooden handle worn pale and smooth in the middle where a hand has held it for years. Below the bluff, the river goes past in the dark. You cannot really see it. You can hear it, though. And once you have heard it, you will hear it for the rest of the night. A low, continuous sound, not a rushing, more like a long, steady breath being let out and never quite finished. And as it moves it carries dust, silt as fine as flour, lifted off the dry lands far away in the west, and carried down here and carried on again, so much of it, so constantly, that the water is not really the colour of water at all. It is the colour of weak tea with too much milk in it. It is the colour of the fields it runs through, and of the walls of the house, and of the dust on the farmer's ankles, and in a little while it will be the colour of a whole civilization's idea of itself. And that is all there is here tonight. A lamp. A roof of drying millet, a hoe by a door, a river the colour of weak tea, breathing in the dark. Nobody standing in that doorway has any idea that they are standing at the beginning of anything, which is generally how beginnings work. But from this small, soft place, a story is going to run on, and on, and on, for 4,000 years, longer than any other story on earth has managed to run. Empires will rise on it, and ripen on it, and tire on it, and be replaced on it, and it will simply go on running, the way the river goes on running. And tonight, very slowly, very slowly, very slowly, we are going to walk all of it, from the first villages of farmers on this yellow dust to a quiet morning 4,000 years later, when a small boy stopped being an emperor and went outside to play. Everyone in this story has been dead for a very long time, and they are in no rush, and the ending has already happened, so nothing tonight can go wrong. So settle now into whatever stillness you have made for yourself tonight. Let the lamp in your own room grow dim, if there is a lamp. Let the small weight of the day slip down off your shoulders, not all at once, just one quiet inch at a time, the way a coat slides slowly off the back of a chair. You are not required to remember any of this. You are not being tested on it. There will be names tonight, and dates, and some of them are 4,000 years old, and if you lose them halfway through a sentence, that is entirely the point. Let them go past like the dust in the river. Take a slow breath in, and let it out, and another, slower, and one more, slower still, until the breathing out lasts longer than the breathing in, which is the small trick the body uses to tell itself that everything, tonight, is fine. If you enjoy these long, quiet walks through history, you might gently like this video, and you might quietly subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and only if it costs you no effort at all right now, because effort is precisely the thing we are trying to put down. And if you are lying awake somewhere, do leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It sounds like a small thing. It is not. There is a whole quiet country of sleepless people scattered across every time zone there is, and reading that it is 2:30 in the morning in a cold northern city helps other sleepless people find their way here and feel a little less alone in the dark. That is the whole ask. Now let it go, and come with me to the river. Because before there was a China, there was no China. There was not even a word for it. No country, no name, no border, no emperor, no dynasty, no writing, and no idea that any of those things might one day exist. There was only the land doing something very slow and very generous that nobody was there to notice. For hundreds of thousands of years, wind had been blowing off the deserts and the dry steppe of Central Asia, carrying dust, and the dust had been settling gently over the north of what we now call China, layer on layer on layer, year after year after year, until it lay in places hundreds of feet deep. Geologists call this dust loess. It is one of the most extraordinary substances on the surface of the planet, and almost nobody outside that part of the world has ever heard of it. Loess is soft. It is so soft that you can dig it with a pointed stick, and so cohesive that when you have dug it, it stays dug, so that a hole in a loess bank does not collapse on you, but simply becomes a room. It is why the earliest people here did not so much build houses as subtract them from the hillside. Loess is also fertile, in a way ordinary soil is not, because it is made of minerals blown fresh off the mountains rather than exhausted by 10,000 seasons of growing, and it will grow grain, and go on growing grain, more or less forever, with a shocking lack of complaint. And it is yellow. It is the colour of turmeric and old paper and dry mustard, and when the wind gets into it, it hangs in the air like flour in a bakery, and settles on everything, on the roofs, on the millet, on the backs of the hands, on the tongue. Through the middle of all this softness runs the river, made of the same stuff. It picks the loess up in the highlands and carries it down, more silt than any other river on earth. People call it the Yellow River, and the name is not poetry, it is just accurate. In its own language it is the Huanghe, and it does something almost no other great river does. Because it carries so much silt, and because the plain it crosses is so flat, the silt drops out and settles on the riverbed, and the bed rises, so that the river is very slowly lifting itself above the countryside, until it runs along the top of a low ridge of its own making, higher than the fields on either side, held in only by its banks, and then, one wet season, it shrugs and goes somewhere else. Not 100 yards. It has been known to move its mouth hundreds of miles, to come out into the sea on the far side of an entire mountain range, drowning everything in between along the way. It has done this again and again, and people gave it a second name for it, bitter and affectionate at once. They called it China's Sorrow. And so there is a bargain written into this landscape, and it never really changes. The river gives you the soil that feeds you, and every so often it takes back everything you have built on it. And the only thing that has ever worked, even slightly, is a very large number of people agreeing to dig together. Almost everything that follows grows in some sense out of a great many people needing to move a great deal of mud in the same direction at the same time. There is a second river far to the south, and it deserves saying now, so that the map is comfortable in your head. It is longer, and it does not run yellow, it runs green and wide and warm, through a country of mist and hills and standing water. The Changjiang, the long river, which the outside world calls the Yangtze, and the two rivers grow two different grains, and the two grains grow two different halves of a civilization. In the north, on the loess, millet, and later wheat, dry farmed, hardy, ground into porridge and flatbread, a food of pale gold and pine smoke and cold mornings. In the south, rice, standing in warm water up to its ankles, green and humid, endlessly hungry for labour, and endlessly generous in return. Millet and rice, dust and water, two rivers, two grains, one long argument, and one long marriage, running the entire length of this story. And onto that landscape, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, come the villages. They are round houses of packed earth with reed roofs, clustered on the safe high ground above the flood, with pigs and dogs and a granary, and in the middle, an open space with a fire in it. The people in them are farmers now, not hunters, which means they have made the great irreversible trade. They have given up the freedom to walk away in exchange for the security of a full granary, and they will never get it back, and mostly they will not want it. They plant millet in the spring. They weed it in the summer. They cut it in the autumn with stone sickles, and the sound of a whole village cutting millet with stone sickles is a soft repeated whispering, hour after hour after hour, like the sea a long way off. The first of these villages that we have given a name to we call the Yangshao culture, and they lived along the Middle Yellow River from about 5,000 years before our era to about 3,000 years before it, which is to say they lasted comfortably for something like 2,000 years, which is longer than any empire in this entire story will manage. We know them mostly by their pots. They made beautiful ones, round-bellied jars of red clay, and they painted them, before firing, with black designs still crisp today, spirals, nets, running water, and strange calm round faces with fish where the ears should be, which nobody has ever explained, and which look, at 3 a.m, as though they know something. And somebody in that world already kept silkworms, because there are fragments of silk and neatly cut cocoons from astonishingly early on, which means somebody once looked at a caterpillar in a mulberry tree and thought there might be a fabric in it, and was right. After them, and partly out of them, comes the Longshan culture, from about 3,000 years before our era to about 1900 before it, and if the Yangshao painted, the Longshan showed off. They made black pottery, burnished to a shine like wet lacquer and thrown on a fast wheel, with walls thinner than the shell of an egg, so absurdly difficult to make that modern potters, with modern kilns, have trouble copying them. They cannot possibly have been for drinking out of. You would break one by looking at it too hard. They were for showing that you were the kind of person who owned something that could be broken by looking at it too hard, which is a form of communication we have never once abandoned. And there is jade, and the jade tells you most about the people, though it takes a moment to see why. Jade is not carved. Jade is far too hard to carve, a bronze knife will not touch it, and neither will steel. Jade is worn away. You cut jade by dragging a wet cord back and forward across it with quartz sand underneath, hour after hour after hour, and the sand very slowly, very slowly, very slowly takes the stone away, a grain at a time. To make a smooth ring of pale green jade the width of a wrist, somebody sat with a piece of string and a bowl of wet sand for what may have been months, in a village with no writing, no state, nothing but grain and daylight, which tells you they had an enormous quantity of something we have since mislaid entirely, and which no amount of cleverness has ever given back to us, and which is simply time. Now the story leaves the ground for a little while and goes up into legend, and we should hold it loosely, the way you hold a story a grandmother tells about her own grandmother. Because when this civilization later sat down to write about its own beginnings, it did not describe villages and pots. It described people. Enormous, calm, capable people who invented things. There is the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, credited with more or less everything, the chariot, the boat, medicine, the calendar, writing, and, by some accounts, silk, by way of his wife, who is supposed to have had a cocoon fall into her hot tea and sat watching it unwind. He is almost certainly not a person. He is a hook that a civilization hung its self-portrait on, and that is a perfectly respectable thing for a man to be. And then there is you. You the great, who is the one to hold on to tonight, because of all the legends this land produced, you is the one that tells you what it valued. The story goes that the waters came, as the waters always come, and Yu's father was set to fixing it, and did the obvious thing, which was to build dams and hold the water back. And the water, being water, waited and rose, and went over the top, and everything was worse than before. So Yu, the son, tried the other thing. He did not fight the water. He dug it channels. He cut the mountains and opened the marshes and gave the flood somewhere to go, and the water, having somewhere to go, went, and the land came back up out of it, dark and silted and ready to plant. And they say he worked for 13 years without once stopping, and that in those 13 years he passed the door of his own house 3 separate times, and heard his own small son crying inside on one of them, and did not go in because the water was not finished yet. That is the founding story. Not a battle, not a conquest, a man with a spade doing drainage for 13 years and refusing to go home. It is quite hard to imagine another civilization choosing that. And out of it, they said, came the first dynasty, the Seer, traditionally beginning around 2070 years before our era, when Yu passed his power not to the worthiest man available, but to his own son, which is the moment when kingship becomes a family business and stays one for the next 4,000 years. Whether the Seer existed at all is still being politely argued about. There is a place called Erlitou, with palace foundations and bronze workshops and roads with cart ruts worn into them. Exactly the right size and exactly the right age, and it does not contain a single line of writing to tell us its own name. So it may be the Shia, or it may be a city that had nothing to do with the Shia and simply had the bad luck to be in the right place. We hold it loosely. Sleep is not improved by certainty. What is not legend, and what is solid and heavy and provable and still sitting in glass cases today, is what comes next. Around 1600 years before our era, the Shang. And with the Shang this story stops being a rumour and starts being a record, because the Shang did 2 things magnificently, and both of them last. The first is bronze. The Shang cast bronze the way later ages painted, or wrote poems, which is to say very considerably better than anybody needed to. They made ritual vessels, and the one to picture is the Ding, a heavy round cauldron standing on 3 legs, with 2 upright handles on the rim, made to hold meat offered to the ancestors. The surfaces are covered, every square inch, in dense interlocking ornament, spirals and thunder patterns and staring animal faces, cast, not carved. Which means somebody built the design backwards in clay moulds and poured molten metal into it and got it right the first time, because there is no second time. They are, 3,500 years later, still the finest bronzes anybody has ever cast. Because the dead had to be fed, and the dead had to be asked. That was the whole business of a Shang king. He was not primarily a general or a judge. He was the man in the family who could talk to the ancestors, and the ancestors, being closer to the powers of the sky than the living were, knew things, and could be consulted, and could be annoyed. And so we come to the second thing the Shang did. They asked their questions on bone. A diviner took the shoulder blade of an ox, flat and broad and pale, or else the undershell of a turtle, scraped it smooth, and drilled a row of little hollows into the back of it, thinning the bone almost all the way through. Then a question was put. Will the harvest be good? Should the king hunt tomorrow? Is the king's toothache caused by an ancestor, and if so, which one? Then a bronze point, heated red in a charcoal fire, was pressed into one of the hollows, and the bone, being bone, cracked with a small sharp sound like a knuckle, and the crack ran in a shape, and the shape was the answer. And afterwards, in tidy little columns beside the crack, somebody scratched down what had been asked, and sometimes what actually happened, so that you occasionally find a divination that was wrong with a small note underneath admitting it. And those scratched marks are writing. Real writing, and here is the part that should be said slowly, it is the direct ancestor of the writing being used in that part of the world tonight, on a phone, on a shop sign, in a book. Every other script of that age is dead. This one just kept going, without ever once stopping, all the way to tonight. And the way it came back to us is, in its own quiet fashion, a comedy. Farmers had for generations been ploughing up these fragments and selling them to apothecaries, where they were labelled dragon bones and ground into powder and sold as medicine, so that the oldest writing in that half of the world spent generations being swallowed, until a scholar in Beijing, around 1899, ill in bed and looking idly at his own prescription, noticed his medicine appeared to have extremely old characters on it. The Shang capital, at the end, was Anyang, also called Yin, on the bend of a small river in the north, and it is out of Anyang that the bones and the bronzes come. And out of Anyang comes one particular tomb, worth pausing over, because it is one of the very few moments in this whole long story where we get to meet somebody rather than merely read about them. Her name was Fu Hao. She was a royal consort, and in 1976 her tomb was found, and, almost uniquely for a royal grave of that age, nobody had ever robbed it. Because it lay in an unglamorous spot outside the main cemetery, and had simply been overlooked for 3,000 years. Inside were nearly 2,000 objects, hundreds of bronzes with her name cast into them, hundreds of pieces of jade, some already antiques when they were buried with her, gathered in from cultures 1,000 years older than she was, which means, delightfully, that Fu Hao had a collection, and bronze battle axes. And when scholars went back to the oracle bones with her name freshly in mind, there she was, all through them, being asked about, being worried over, being consulted. Fu Hao leading troops. Fu Hao commanding thousands of men against the tribes of the north. Fu Hao performing the great sacrifices, which was a king's own work. She was a general, a high priestess, a landholder in her own right, and a queen, and her husband went on asking the ancestors about her long after she was dead. And she has been asleep under all her bronzes for 3,000 years, which is, when you think about it, quite a lot of sleep, and rather a good thing to be thinking about at this hour of the night. But the Shang wore out, the way every one of them wears out. The last king is remembered as King Zhou of Shang, and here is a small confusing detail we will say exactly once and then let go of. His name sounds just like the name of the dynasty that replaced him. The two are entirely unrelated, and everybody involved has had 3,000 years to sort this out, and has quietly chosen not to. He is remembered as cruel, as extravagant, as filling a lake with wine, and as being led astray by a beautiful and wicked consort. Every last king of every dynasty in this story is remembered that way. It is not a description. It is a job requirement, written afterwards, by the people who replaced him, because they needed him to have deserved it. And so, out of the west, up the valley of the Wei River, a smaller and rougher and rather more sober people came down, the Zhou. Their leader is remembered as King Wen, the cultured king, who prepared everything and did not live to finish it, and it was his son, King Wu, the martial king, who at last brought the army east. They met the Shang host on a field called Mue in the year 1046 before our era, and the Shang army, we are told, was enormous, and was also largely made up of people with no particular reason to fight for the man in charge of it, and so it did not so much break as decline. The last Shang king went back to his palace and burned it around himself. And that was that. A dynasty of 600 years ended in a single grey morning on a field, and the millet went on growing on the lowest 2 days' walk away, without any interruption whatsoever. But the Zhou had a problem, and their answer to it is the single most important idea in this entire 4,000-year story, and it was invented essentially as an excuse. The Shang kings were the ones who talked to the ancestors. That was the basis of their whole authority. So by what right does a small Western clan walk in and take that over? What makes a conqueror anything other than a thief with more men? And the Zhou's answer, worked out largely by King Wu's brother, was the mandate of heaven. Tianming, it says that heaven, which is not quite a god but something more like the moral weather, grants the right to rule to whoever will rule justly, and that this right is a loan and not a possession. Rule well, and heaven keeps you. Rule badly, and heaven grows quietly disgusted and hands the mandate to somebody else, who is therefore not a rebel at all, but an instrument. And you can tell when the mandate is slipping, because heaven mentions it, through floods, through famine, through earthquakes, through comets, through a river changing its course. Heaven, in this system, clears its throat. It does two opposite things at once, which is exactly why it lasted. It makes every ruler legitimate, and it makes every ruler nervous permanently about the weather. It gives the peasantry, right at the bottom, a genuine right of revolution, which almost no other government in the ancient world ever wrote into its own foundations. And it has one further quality, which we should mention flatly and then move gently on from, the mandate of heaven has the extremely useful property of always being right afterwards. If you won, you had it. If you lost, you had lost it. It cannot be checked in advance, only confirmed in retrospect, which is precisely what you want in a theory of government, and precisely what you do not want in anything else. And the brother who worked all of this out deserves his moment, because of what he did next. King Wu died only a few years after his great victory, leaving a small son, and his brother, the Duke of Zhou, took the regency, put down a revolt raised by his own other brothers, laid out the new kingdom's ritual, and held absolute power for 7 years, with a child on the throne and nobody in any position to stop him. And then, when the boy came of age, he handed it all back, and stepped down, and went and served him. In the whole of this story there is not a common ending. It became the model every minister for the next 3,000 years was quietly measured against, and 5 centuries later a teacher in a small eastern state would remark that he knew he was growing old because he no longer dreamed of the Duke of Zhou, and everybody who heard him knew exactly what he meant. So the Western Zhou settle in, with their capital at Haojing, in the Wei Valley in the west, near where the city of Shan stands today. And they hold the land not as an empire but as a family arrangement, parcelling the country out to relatives and allies who hold their patch, send their tribute, and come when they are called. It works. For a long time. Nearly 300 years of bronze bells and ritual and chariots and ancestor halls and slow, well-mannered government, and the classic texts beginning to take shape. And, out in the fields, and this is the part that never changes, a man on the loess with a hoe, growing millet, paying his grain, and having only the very loosest idea of who exactly is king this year. And then, very gradually, and with no drama at all, it goes thin. The later kings are less impressive than the earlier ones. The cousins out in the provinces get further away in blood with every generation, and a cousin 4 generations removed is really just a neighbour with an army. The tribute arrives later, then short, then has to be asked for. And in the year 771 before our era, the tribes from beyond the frontier came down the valley, in alliance, as it happens, with some extremely disappointed royal in-laws, and the capital at Haojing fell, and the king was killed at the foot of a hill, and the whole apparatus of the Western court, the bells and the bronzes and the scribes and the ritual and the horses, packed up whatever it could carry and moved east, to Luoyang, to start again. And they did start again, after a fashion. The kings went on being kings in Luoyang for another 500 years. They were bowed to, their ritual was performed, their calendar was used, and none of it meant anything at all anymore, because the centre had gone soft, and the states out beyond it had noticed. So we stop here, in the year 771 before our era, on a road going east, with a court-moving house, and back on the bluff above the Yellow River, in the dark, the small oil lamp is still burning in the doorway. It has been burning through all of this. It burned through the painted pots and the eggshell cups, and through the man grinding away at his ring of jade with a string and a bowl of wet sand, and through the flood and the digging of the channels, and through the cracking of the bones and the pouring of the bronze, and through Fu Hao going down under her axes into the dark, and through a field at Mue on a grey morning, and through the invention of the best excuse in the history of government. It is only a shallow clay dish with a little fat in it and a twist of hemp for a wick, and it does not know about any of it. And by the door, the hoe is leaning where it always leans, and in the morning the farmer will pick it up and go out and hoe his millet on the yellow dust above the river, exactly as his family have done for 2,000 years, having heard, perhaps, that the king has moved house, and having thought about that for a moment, and having gone back to the millet. So the court went east, and the court stayed east. It was not a long road, only a few 100 miles of dust and river valley, only a matter of packing the bronzes and the drums and the ritual books and walking away from the western hills toward Luoyang on the plain. But it was the kind of short journey a country never quite comes back from. the kings arrived and were housed and were bowed to, and went on being kings in every way that could be written down and in almost no way that could be felt. They kept the calendar, they kept the sacrifices, they kept the right to say who ruled where, and the states below them kept the courtesy of asking for a while, and then kept the courtesy of pretending to ask, and then, very slowly, very slowly, very slowly, stopped bothering to pretend. Nobody announced this. There was no morning on which the Zhou stopped mattering. It happened the way a fire goes out in a room where everybody is talking, which is to say gradually, and with nobody watching the grate. And this is the first thing to settle into tonight, softly, with the lamp low and the blanket warm. For the next 500 years, the man everybody called the Son of Heaven sat in Luoyang with almost nothing to do, and the story of China went on happening somewhere else entirely, in a great slow scattering of small courts, each one convinced it was the important one. Historians later gave this long, strange stretch a name, and they did not call it the Age of Collapse, or the Century of Knives, or anything with weather in it. They called it Spring and Autumn, after a chronicle, a dry little year-by-year account kept in the small eastern state of Lu, in which somebody wrote down, season after season, that in the spring the Duke went hunting, and in the autumn there was a frost, and that a comet was seen, and that a wall was repaired. It reads like a ledger kept by a very tired clerk, and out of that thin, dutiful little book comes the name for 2.5 centuries of Chinese history. A fine reminder that people living through an age rarely know what to call it, and would probably be surprised by our choice. So, spring and autumn, from 770, when the court arrived in Luoyang, down to about 476, before the counting of our own years began. The land in those years was not one country. It was more like a garden left to itself, well over 100 small states at the start, some no bigger than a market town and a hill, each with its own duke, its own ancestral temple, its own patch of millet, its own tidy conviction of being at the centre. They were tied together by ritual and by marriage, and by a kind of elaborate good manners designed for a world with a strong king in it, and practised long after the strong king had gone. The way a family keeps laying a place at the table out of habit. So the wars for a long time were still polite, fought from chariots, by aristocrats who knew one another, in the summer, after the planting and before the harvest, with rules about not striking a state already in mourning, and about waiting sometimes, while the other side finished crossing the river, because it would have been unhandsome not to. Slowly the chariots thinned out and the foot soldiers thickened up, and the states ate one another, 100 becoming 40, 40 becoming 20, 20 becoming a handful of large and watchful animals. And all through this, in the years the chronicle recorded only as frost and hunting, the truly extraordinary thing was happening. Because this is the age in which China thought its thoughts. It is one of the quiet oddities of history that people do their best thinking when their world is coming apart, and the answers those men gave, sitting on cold floors in small rooms in a broken century, are still being lived in tonight by more people than any other set of ideas on earth. Begin then with the teacher. He was born in the small state of Lu, the same tidy little place with the dry chronicle, in 551 before our era, into a family that had once been minor nobility, and by his time was mostly just poor. His name in his own language is Kongzi, the Master Kong, though we know him by the softened shape some travelling missionaries gave him 2,000 years later, and so we will call him Confucius, gently tonight, and here is the thing about him that almost nobody expects. He wanted a job. He wanted, quite badly, a proper post in a proper government, with real power to do real good, and he never truly got one. For something like 13 years he wandered from court to court with a handful of students, explaining patiently to one duke after another how a state ought properly to be run, and being received with enormous courtesy, and fed, and thanked, and shown to a comfortable room, and then not employed. Rulers liked him. Rulers found him impressive. Rulers did not, on the whole, want to be told that the way to govern was to be good, when the more pressing question that season was who had the crossbows. He went home to Lu an old man, having, as far as he could see, accomplished nothing at all, and he taught. And then he died in 479 before our era, quite certain that his life had not worked out. The most influential teacher in the history of our species spent his last years considering himself a failure, which he was for about 200 years, after which the failure quietly became the operating system of a civilization and has stayed that way ever since. He would probably have found this amusing, though not, one suspects. Immediately, what he taught is easier to feel than to define, and it is best taken slowly, like warm water. He never wrote a book. What we have are the analects, simply his sayings, written down by his students and their students, a scrapbook rather than a system, full of small remarks and long silences, and the occasional flash of a man being tired or funny. At the middle of it sits a word, Ren. It is often translated as humaneness, or benevolence, or fellow feeling, and none of those quite carry it. The written character for it is a person, and the number 2. That is all it is. Ren is what happens between one person and another person, and it cannot be practiced alone, and there is no test for it except a lifetime. Around Ren he set Li, usually translated as ritual, which sounds to modern ears like the dullest possible virtue, all bowing and incense, and knowing which sleeve goes where. But he meant form, the shapes we make with our behaviour so that the people around us know where they stand. He thought that if you practice the outward shape sincerely and for long enough, the inward feeling grows into it, the way a young tree grows into a stake. And around those he set filial piety, the honouring of parents and elders and the dead, on the reasonable ground that a man who cannot be decent to his own mother is unlikely to be much use to a province. And he had one word for the goal of all of it, the Junzi. It had always meant a lord's son, an accident of birth. He simply turned it inside out. In his hands the Junzi is the gentleman, and he is a gentleman by conduct only, and a peasant may be one and a duke may not, and no ancestor can hand it to you. That quiet redefinition, made by an unemployed man in a small state in a broken century, is one of the largest doors ever opened in human affairs. As for government, he had almost no policy at all, which is why the dukes kept not hiring him. His whole doctrine of statecraft is that the ruler should be good, visibly and without theatre, and that the people will then be good in the same direction, the way grass leans when the wind crosses a field. Punish people, and they will avoid punishment and feel no shame. Lead them by example, and they will feel shame and correct themselves, and you will not need the punishments. It is either the most naive thing ever said about power or the most practical, and the interesting part is that 2,000 years of Chinese officials who were not naive men went on believing it was the second. And while the master was going from court to court being politely ignored, another set of ideas was moving in exactly the opposite direction. And China has been holding both of them ever since, one in each hand, without any apparent discomfort. Tradition gives it a man called Laozi, the old master, and tradition is a little vague about him on purpose. He may have been an archivist in the Zhou court, keeping the records of a dynasty that no longer needed them. He may have been several people. He may have been nobody. The story says he grew tired of the world and rode west on an ox to leave it, and that a guard at the mountain pass asked him to write something down before he went, and that he wrote about 5,000 characters and handed them over and rode on out of history, which is, if nothing else, the most stylish exit anyone in this story ever makes. What he left is the Tao Te Ching, and it says, more or less, this: there is a way that things go. Not a law, not a god, not a plan, a grain, like the grain in wood. It is called the Tao. You cannot say what it is. The book opens by cheerfully admitting that any Tao you can put into words is already the wrong one, which is an unusual way to begin a book about it. And the way to live well is not to push. It is Wu Wei, usually translated as non-action, and much better understood as effortless action, or simply not shoving. Be like water, the softest thing there is, which yields to everything and goes around every obstacle without argument, and which nonetheless, given enough time and no hurry whatsoever, wears the stone away entirely. The Confucian says, build the shape and grow into it. The Taoist says, put the shape down and let the water find its level. And for the next 2,500 years, the same person will be a Confucian at the office and a Taoist in the garden, and will see nothing contradictory about this at all, and will be, on the whole, right, and out of the same restless century comes a third book, thinner than either. Sun Tzu, the master son, may or may not have been a general in the state of Wu. His book is The Art of War, and what is rarely mentioned is that it is very largely a book about how not to fight. Its highest praise is kept for the commander who wins without a battle, because long campaigns exhaust the state and beggar the people. It is a manual for the avoidance of expense, written in an age about to become extremely expensive, by a man who was quite clearly ignored because the politeness ran out. Somewhere around 475 before our era, historians draw a line and change the name, and the age stops being called Spring and Autumn and starts being called, with no softening at all this time, the Warring States. The rules went first, then the chariots, then the summers only. The lords stopped calling themselves lords and began calling themselves kings, which was formally an insult to the man still sitting in Luoyang, and which nobody in Luoyang was in any position to do anything about. And the 100 little states had boiled down to 7 large ones. Worth learning the way you learn the names of hills you can see from a window, Chin, said like Chin. Away in the west up the Wei River Valley, rough and unfashionable and largely dismissed. Chu, enormous and green and southern, down in the marshes and rice of the Yangtze. Chi on the eastern sea. Salt and fish and merchants and money, Yan in the cold northeast, and Zhao and Wei and Han in the crowded middle. 7 of them, grinding against one another for 250 years. And war changed, in these years, from a sport into an industry. Bronze had been the metal of ritual and of aristocrats. Iron was the metal of everybody. Iron ploughshares turned soil that bronze had only scratched, and the harvests grew and the population grew, and iron went into the men as well as the soil. The crossbow arrived, a device of rather democratic cruelty, since a bow takes years of training and a crossbow takes an afternoon. Armies stopped being a few hundred chariots and became 100,000 walking men, conscripted, drilled, counted, fed, and lost. And along the northern edge, where the fields gave out and the grass began, and the horsemen came down off the steppe when the weather turned, the northern states began pounding up long walls of rammed earth, poured into wooden frames and beaten down with poles by lines of villagers who sang while they beat, so as to keep time. Not stone. Not brick, just yellow dirt, made stubborn, standing along the grass. And here is the deep, pleasant paradox of the whole chapter. Precisely because everything was falling apart, everything was being thought. The 7 kings all wanted an edge, and an edge might be anywhere, and so for the first and possibly the last time in history it was a genuinely excellent career move to be a philosopher. Kings collected them in academies and paid them and fed them and asked them things, and later ages called it the 100 schools of thought, which is generous but not by much. Mencius came in the Confucian line a century or so after the master and put the warmest possible floor under the whole building. People, he said, are good by nature, born with it, the seed already there. The way a hillside has grass in it before you see any. And his proof is the loveliest argument in classical philosophy. Imagine a child, crawling, about to go over the lip of a well. Anyone who sees it will feel a lurch, and that lurch, arriving before any thinking has been done, is the whole of morality in miniature, and everybody has one, and all education is only the watering of a sprout already in the ground. Zunzi came and disagreed, politely and thoroughly. People, he said, are born crooked, and will take what they want, and goodness is not a sprout but a craft. Timber is not born straight. It is steamed and bent against the frame until it is. and that is what ritual and learning and music are for. He was not being cruel, he just did not think goodness happened by itself, any more than a garden weeds itself while you sleep. And Mosey came, who is the one nobody expects and everybody likes. He preached universal love, not the graded family first love of the Confucians, in which you owe your father more than your neighbour, but a flat and cheerful impartiality in which everyone's father counts the same. He thought music was a waste of money and elaborate funerals a waste of everything, and made himself faintly ridiculous by saying so. But the Mohists were also engineers, and they were against war, and so they organised themselves into small disciplined bands who would walk to any city being besieged by anybody and help defend it, for free, on principle, without asking whose city it was or what the quarrel had been about. They invented counter-siege machinery, and tunnels, and hooks for pulling ladders off walls, a school of gentle, hard-headed pacifists who made themselves the finest defensive engineers of the age, purely so that attacking anybody would stop being worth the trouble. And then, at the other end of the room, sitting quite calmly, there was Han Feisey and the legalists, and the lamp should be turned down a little for them, because they are the ones who won. They had no interest whatsoever in whether people are good. They thought the question sentimental and worse, unmeasurable. What people respond to, they said, is reward and punishment, and nothing else. So, write the law down plainly and apply it identically to the Duke's cousin and to the ditch digger, every time, without exception, and without ever once caring how anybody feels about it. Do not rule by virtue, virtue is rare, and a state cannot be built on a substance that runs out. Rule by system. And the uncomfortable thing about legalism, the thing worth turning over slowly rather than dismissing on the way to sleep, is that it works. It works enormously well, for a while. It is a bleak, cold, tidy, unlovable idea that gets the grain in, and the roads built and the armies fed. Which brings us west, up the Wei River Valley, to the state everybody had been ignoring. Qin was not admired. Qin was the frontier. It sat out where the good land thinned into hills and the neighbours were horsemen, and the other 6 states regarded it much as a capital regards a mining town. Useful, no doubt, and not somewhere one dines. And in the middle of the 4th century before our era, a legalist named Shang Yang arrived there from the east, having found nobody in the civilist states willing to let him try his ideas, and found a young ruler with nothing to lose, and was handed the whole thing to play with. What he did to Qin over the next 20 years is one of the strangest exercises in history, because he did not reform a country. He replaced it with a mechanism. He abolished the old aristocracy's automatic rank and put in its place a ladder of 20 grades that could be climbed by exactly 2 activities: growing grain and fighting. Nothing else counted. Not birth, not charm, not learning, not music, not the good opinion of the neighbours. He grouped the households into 5s and 10s and made every group answerable for every member of it, so that a man's neighbours had an urgent personal interest in his behaviour. He standardised the measures, he surveyed the fields, he wrote the law up on posts in the marketplace where anyone could read it, and then applied it to the Crown Prince's tutors when the Crown Prince broke it, on the grounds that a law which bends once is not a law but a suggestion. And it worked. It worked terribly, magnificently well. Qin's harvests rose and Qin's armies became the most frightening thing on the continent, because a Qin soldier was not fighting for his lord or his honour or his ancestors, he was fighting for grade 7, and grade 7 was written down, and grade 7 came with land. Shangyang himself was destroyed in the end by the very machine he had built, having made a system that did not care who you were, and which turned out not to care who he was either. And so 100 years later, when the 7 states looked at one another across their walls, 6 of them were countries, and 1 of them was an engine. Ying Zheng became king of Qin as a boy of 13 in 247 before our era, and what he did with that state he did in 25 years. He ate the other 6. Han first, then Zhao, then Wei, then Chu, the huge green southern one, then Yan, then Qi last, which surrendered almost without a fight, having watched the others go. And in 221 before our era he stood alone, the first man ever to hold all of it, and found that there was no word for what he now was. King would not do. There had been kings by the dozen, and he had just finished collecting them. So he took 2 words out of the oldest legends, the words for the mythic god-kings and the sage emperors of the far-off beginning, and welded them together into a title nobody had ever used, and put a number in front of it, and called himself the first emperor. Qin Shi Huang. And the number was not vanity, exactly. It was arithmetic. He expected a second emperor and a third and a thousandth, on and on for 10,000 generations, his family holding the world he had made until the sun got tired. It held for 15 years. But oh, what he did in them! And this is the part the ghost stories always leave out, and it is the reason a country exists tonight. With his chancellor Li Si beside him, a cold, clever man who had studied under Junzi and taken from that gentle teacher only the hard half, he set about making 7 things into one thing, not with speeches, but with specifications. The writing was first. Every state had drifted into its own shapes for the same characters over the loose Zhou centuries, and he simply chose, and issued the standard, and enforced it, and from that moment a man in the wet south and a man on the dusty north could write to each other, even if they could not have understood a word the other said out loud, which is why to this day a country with a great many spoken tongues reads one script. Then the coins round with a square hole punched in the middle so they could be strung on a cord, the same in every market from the sea to the desert. Then the weights and the measures cast in bronze and sent out to every county, so that a bushel was a bushel everywhere. Then the axles, and this is the detail that makes people laugh a little and then go quiet, because it is so absurdly practical and so completely revealing. In a country of soft yellow Loess roads, carts wear ruts, and the ruts become the road, and a cart whose wheels are the wrong distance apart cannot use them, and must plough its own way through the dirt beside them at half the speed. So he standardized the axle width of every cart in the empire. 1 gauge, everywhere, suddenly any wagon could roll down any rut in any province at full speed. And grain could move, and soldiers could move, and the country, physically, mechanically, became one surface. He also joined the walls. The old rammed earth barriers that Yan and Zhao and Qin had each thrown up along their northern edges were connected, extended, patched into a single line running along the top of the grasslands, earth and gravel and sweat, and an unrecorded enormous number of conscripted men working in the wind. It was not the wall you are picturing. That one comes much, much later, and belongs to a house that has not been born yet. This one was dirt, and much of it has simply gone back to being hills. And there is the other side, and it should be said plainly and without relish, because it happened, and it does not need decorating. He did not like being disagreed with, and he had read enough legalism to consider disagreement a defect in the machine. So the books that praised the past were called in and burned, the poetry, the histories of the states he had swallowed. Everything that let a scholar say things had once been better. Copies were kept in the Imperial Library, where the right people could consult them, which is a very particular kind of thinking, and some hundreds of scholars, by the tradition, were silenced, and the number is argued about, and the manner is argued about, and none of the arguing improves it. Say it once, and move on, the way you would step around something on a path at night. He was, underneath all of it, frightened, and that is almost the only human thing left of him across 2,000 years. He had made himself master of everything under heaven, and could not bear the one arrangement he had not been able to standardize, which was that he was going to die. So he sent expeditions out onto the eastern sea to look for the islands of the immortals, and the ships did not come back, which was probably wise of them. He kept alchemists, and their preparations were largely cinnabar and mercury, a bright, heavy, beautiful liquid metal, the age believed to be the very stuff of permanence, since it does not rust and does not change and shines forever. He swallowed it for years. It is now generally agreed that this treatment substantially shortened the search. He died in 210 before our era, on the road, far from his capital, on one of the endless inspection tours he made through the country he had assembled, and there is a detail here so perfect it is almost unkind. His death was concealed until the party could get home, and the summer being what it is in the lowest country. They packed a cart of salted fish in beside the imperial carriage, so that nobody would wonder about the smell. The man who standardized the axle widths of the world came home behind a cartload of fish, and the arrangement worked, and nobody asked. What he was buried in, out at Lintong near the Way, is the thing everyone knows. A tomb mound like a low hill, and under it, by an account written a century afterwards, a whole model empire, palaces and towers, and the rivers of the country running in mercury under a ceiling of jewelled stars. That inner tomb has never been opened. But in the fields around it he put an army, thousands of soldiers made of clay, life-size, standing in ranks in trenches in the dark, infantry and archers and charioteers and horses, painted once in bright colours the earth has long since taken back, and each one, this is the part that stops people in front of the glass, each one with a different face. Not a mould stamped out 1,000 times. Different cheekbones, different moustaches, different ears, made by workshops of men whose lives are otherwise entirely gone. He had them made because he was taking no chances, and because if there was going to be something after this, he intended to arrive with an escort. And they stood there. They stood in their ranks in the dark under the fields for 2,000 years, while every dynasty in this story rose and ripened and tired, and was replaced above their heads, and the farmers ploughed over them, and grew millet and persimmons and pomegranates, and never knew. And then in 1974 some men digging a well in a dry season put a spade through a head, and so, at last, in 206 before our era, the machine stopped. It stopped almost at once, and almost without a fight, because the thing about a mechanism is that it needs an operator, and the first emperor had built a state entirely around a man of enormous will, and left it to a son who had none. DC came to a bad end. The conscript gangs, marching to the wall in the rain, and knowing that arriving late carried the same penalty as rebelling, made the obvious calculation and rebelled. The swallowed states remembered their names. 15 years after it began, the dynasty that was to last 10,000 generations was over, which is a lesson so often repeated in this story that we may as well take it now and be done with it. Nearly every dynasty announced that it would last 10,000 years, and not one of them made it to 1,000. But here is the quiet, warm, extraordinary thing to fall asleep on. The Qin fell, and everything the Qin made stayed. The script stayed. The coins stayed, the measures stayed, the roads and their ruts stayed. The idea of an emperor, one man, one calendar, one law, one country from the desert to the sea, stayed, and would be picked up within a handful of years by a village official with no manners and no lineage at all, and passed hand to hand down 21 centuries. Even the name stayed, Qin, set out west along the trade tracks and carried by camel across the Taklamakan, and repeated by traders in Persia and Greece and Rome, wearing down over the miles the way a word does, until it arrived in the mouths of people who had no idea what it meant, and became, in the end, China. And up above the yellow river, on the soft yellow bluff, in the doorway of the mud-walled house, the small oil lamp was still burning. The dust still came down the water in the dark. The millet was still drying on the roof. And the farmer, who had lived under the Zhou, and under a king of Qin, and under the first emperor of all under heaven, and now under nobody in particular, had noticed almost none of it, except that the carts on the road below had all begun, for some reason, to fit each other's tracks, and that the man who came for the grain used a measure he did not argue with any more. Then he banked the fire, and went in, and the river went on going by. So the machine stopped, and the country it had invented was still there, and for a few years nobody was entirely sure who was holding it. In 206 before our era, the roads of the Qin were still perfectly straight and perfectly empty. The standard weights still sat on their standard counters. The standard coins still had their neat square holes, and the whole enormous apparatus of the First Empire went on lying across the land like a suit of armour with nobody inside it. The armour did not rust. That is the strange thing to hold on to tonight, gently, as you settle in. The Qin fell in a breath, and almost nothing the Qin had built fell with it. What followed was not a return to the old scattered world of many small states with many small kings. What followed was an argument, carried on for 4 years by men on horses, about who should wear the armour next. And out of that argument, very slowly, very slowly, very slowly, came 400 years of something the Chinese have been quietly comparing everything else to ever since. There were 2 men in the argument. One of them was everything a hero is supposed to be. His name was Shang Yu, and he came of an old aristocratic house from the state of Chu, and he was said to be enormous, and strong enough to lift a bronze cauldron over his head, and brave in the way that the sons of old houses were expected to be brave, which is to say loudly and in front of witnesses. He fought beautifully. He won nearly every battle he entered. He carved the world up as he pleased and handed out kingdoms to the men he liked, and he burned the Qin capital at Xianyang, and the fire is said to have gone on burning for 3 months, which, even allowing for the natural enthusiasm of historians, is a great deal of fire. The other man was Liu Bang. Liu Bang was a village official from a farming family, a minor functionary in charge of a minor post station in a minor county, and he was, by the honest account of the people who wrote about him afterwards, fond of a drink, fond of a joke, casually rude, allergic to ceremony, and not especially interested in reading. He had a moustache and a loud laugh, and a habit of borrowing money he did not repay quickly. He was not brave in the way Shang Yu was brave. He lost battles. He lost a great many battles, and he had a talent unusual among men of that kind of century, for losing a battle without losing his temper or his nerve or his sense of where the road went next. And he had one quality that turned out to be worth more than a bronze cauldron lifted over the head, which was that people liked him, and stayed with him, and told him the truth, and did not particularly mind when he took their advice and forgot to say where it came from. The contest between the 2 of them ran from 206 to 202 before our era, and it is remembered in China the way certain long, quiet rivalries are remembered everywhere, which is to say fondly, and with a chessboard. Even now the 2 halves of a Chinese chessboard are divided by a river drawn across the middle, and that river is that war. The board is still being played on in parks at dusk, by old men who slap the pieces down harder than they need to. 2 men who have been dust for more than 2,000 years are still, in a manner of speaking, having their argument on a folding table under a plane tree next to a thermos of tea. Xiang Yu lost. He lost at the very end, all at once, the way the brave sometimes do, and Liu Bang, the shabby village official who liked to drink, stood up in 202 before our era and became the Emperor Gaozu and founded the Han. It is worth pausing here for a moment in the dark, because it is one of the gentlest jokes the story of China ever makes. After the Qin, after all that legalist iron, after the measuring and the watching and the ranking and the terrifying efficiency of a state built like a piece of machinery, the whole thing was finally handed to a man whose principal qualification was that he was good company. He set his capital in the west, in the old Wei River Valley where the Zhou and the Qin had risen before him, at a place called Chang'an, which means long peace, and which was, on the whole, a fairly ambitious thing to call a city in that particular century. And there he did the sensible thing, which was almost nothing. He kept the Qin's roads and the Qin's script and the Qin's coins and the Qin's counties and the Qin's careful columns of officials. He kept the machine. He simply took his foot off it. He cut the taxes. He cut the punishments, which under the Qin had included a rich and detailed menu of things to remove from a person. he let the villagers breathe. He is said to have been so uninterested in court ritual that his scholars had to invent a ceremony gradually, over years, easing him into being an emperor by degrees, the way you might ease a large dog into a bath. And that, more or less, is the Han settlement, the Qin's bones, with softer flesh on them. It is the shape the country would keep, on and off, for the next 2,000 years, and it was arrived at not by grand design, but by an amiable man deciding not to break what already worked. The dynasty took its name from the Han River, a modest tributary of the Yangtze, and the names stuck the way very few names ever stick. The majority ethnicity of China is called Han today. The characters on a Chinese page today are called Han characters. A dynasty that lasted 4 centuries turned into a word that has lasted 22, and is still, at this moment, being written on forms and typed into telephones by more than 1 billion people who are not thinking about a village official with a loud laugh at all. The other great thing the Han did, they did slowly, and it happened mostly in rooms. The Qin had governed by law and fear, and had burned the books of the scholars who disagreed. The Han, having no great enthusiasm for either burning or fear, went looking for the books again, and found them in the walls of houses where careful people had bricked them up, and in the memories of very old men who had learnt them by heart as boys, and had been waiting, with the patience of the very old, for someone to ask. And over the 1st century of the dynasty, the teachings of Confucius, which in his own lifetime had been the private hobby of an unemployed schoolmaster, wandering from court to court being politely ignored, quietly became the official doctrine of the largest state on earth. That is when the scholar official was born, the man who governs because he has read, rather than because he was born. It is the most important quiet invention in this entire story. Not the wall, not the crossbow, not even, in the end, a paper. The idea that the person who runs the county should be the person who has studied how a county ought to be run, and that studying should be a road anyone might walk down, is the thing that this civilization kept coming back to, and refining, and getting wrong, and coming back to again. For the next 20 centuries, under the Han the road was still narrow and still favoured the sons of the comfortable, and men were still recommended for office by other men, in the way of all worlds everywhere. But the direction had been chosen. From here on, in China, the highest ambition of a clever boy in a mud-walled house was not to become a warrior, it was to become a clerk. Which brings us to the man who did more than anyone else to make the Han into an empire rather than merely a country, and who was, it must be said, not a clerk at all. The Emperor Wu came to the throne as a boy and stayed on it for 54 years, which was the longest reign anyone in China had yet managed, and he used those 54 years the way a man uses a very large sum of inherited money. He pushed the borders west into the deserts and south to the sea and the rice lands, and the far coast where Canton sits today, and north against the steppe horsemen who had been arriving for centuries whenever the grass failed, and leaving whenever they were bought off. He founded the Imperial Academy, a school for future officials, with an intake at first of some 50 young men, a number that would grow over the following centuries into a system that swallowed the ambitions of an entire civilization. He made Confucianism the state's own creed in name as well as in habit. He spent and spent and spent, and by the end of him the treasury was a sad and echoing place, and the country was twice the size it had been. That is more or less the arrangement history usually offers, and Chinese historians, who were mostly Confucians and mostly disapproved of him, have been grumbling about the bill ever since, while quietly enjoying the empire it bought. And then, in 139 before our era, he did the small thing that turned out to be the enormous thing. He sent a man west. The man's name was Zhang Qian, and his errand was ordinary diplomacy of the least romantic kind. Go beyond the deserts, find a tribe we have heard of who also dislike the horsemen, and ask them if they would like to dislike the horsemen together. He set out with about 100 men. He was captured almost immediately by exactly the people he was supposed to be sneaking past, and he was held for 10 years, and in the course of those 10 years he married and had a child and, one presumes, learned to live with it. Then he escaped, and instead of turning east and going home, which is what nearly anyone would do after 10 years, he continued west, because that was still the errand. He crossed the mountains. He found the tribe. The tribe, comfortable at last in a green valley a very long way from their old troubles, listened politely and declined. He turned around, was captured again, escaped again, and came home after 13 years with 2 of his 100 men still alive. He had failed. His mission had achieved precisely nothing that it had set out to achieve. But he had walked further west than any Chinese person had ever walked and come back to describe it. And what he brought home instead was news. That out there, past the yellow sand and the dead white salt flats and the mountains with their heads in the cloud, there were other worlds. Cities of mud brick with markets in them. Kingdoms with kings. People who grew grapes and made wine from them, and had never in their lives heard of an emperor. And horses. Great tall horses, out in the far western valleys, so much finer than the shaggy ponies of the steppe that the reports of them said they sweated blood, which is the sort of detail that survives translation and common sense alike, and gets into the poems anyway. The emperor wanted the horses. That is, in the end, the reason. The greatest overland trade route in the history of the world was opened because an emperor heard about some very good horses and could not stop thinking about them. Missions went west, and merchants followed the missions, and garrisons followed the merchants, and posts and wells and watchtowers followed the garrisons out into the dry country, and within a few decades there was a thread of dust and hooves and camel bells running from Chang'an out along the corridor between the mountains and the desert, splitting to go north or south around the terrible Taklamakan, and on to Persia, and on past Persia to places whose names nobody in Chang'an had ever heard. We call it the Silk Road, which is a name given to it 18 centuries later by a foreign geographer, and which nobody who ever walked it would have recognized. It was never one road. It was never mostly about silk. It was a haze of small journeys, a market town to the next market town, a cousin to a cousin, goods passed along hand over hand across half the world, so that a bolt of silk might change owners 40 times between the loom and the last buyer, and no single person on the whole route ever saw both ends of it. Nobody walked it from beginning to end. It walked itself. But the silk went. It went west, and it went west, and it went west, and it arrived at last, cool as water and light as breath, and dyed in colours nobody there had seen, among people so far away that they had no explanation for it whatsoever. And so those people made one up. They decided, quite reasonably given the evidence available, that silk was a kind of wool that grew on trees, and that somewhere in the Far East there were forests where you could comb the cloth off the branches. They believed this for centuries. They wrote it down in their natural histories, where it sat looking authoritative. It is a very good reminder, tonight, of what a fact is. A fact is often only the best story anyone has been able to reach so far, told with confidence, and things came back the other way, which is the half of the road that gets forgotten. Grapes came. Alfalfa came, to feed the horses that had started all of it. Walnuts, pomegranates, cucumbers, sesame, a kind of onion, glass, which the Chinese found charming and slightly vulgar, and, a little later and very quietly, on a camel, in a bundle, wrapped in cloth, a religion, which we will come to when the night is older. While all this was happening out in the dust, a man was sitting in Chang'an writing. His name was Sima Qian, and his father had been the court's grand historian before him, and had died leaving the work unfinished, and his son the burden of finishing it. What Sima Qian set out to write was not a chronicle of a reign. It was everything, the whole of the past, from the legendary emperors down to the men walking around outside his own window, arranged not as one long list, but as a set of interlocking parts, the annals of rulers, the tables of years, the treatises on ritual and music and rivers and money, and, best of all, the lives, hundreds of biographies of individual people. Not only kings and ministers, but assassins, jesters, doctors, merchants, wandering swordsmen, a man famous for being funny. He wrote about people he disliked with such fairness that you can still hear him disliking them. Partway through, he made the mistake of defending a disgraced general in front of the Emperor Wu, who was not, at that stage of his 54 years, a man who enjoyed being contradicted. Sima Qian was given the choice between death and a mutilation so shaming that men of his class were expected to choose death instead. He chose to live, and said, in the letter that survives, that he chose it because the book was not finished. He finished it. It runs to more than 500,000 characters. It is called the Shiji, the Records of the Grand Historian, and every official history China wrote for the next 2,000 years, and it wrote them steadily, dynasty after dynasty, each new house solemnly writing up the house it had replaced, was built on the shape he invented, in a room, in disgrace, on purpose. The Han did not run smoothly forever, because nothing does. In the year 9 of our own era, a court official named Wang Mang, having spent decades being the most virtuous and modest man anyone in the palace had ever met, gently took the throne and announced a new dynasty called the Xin, meaning new, which is at least honest advertising. He was a Confucian idealist of the most sincere and dangerous kind. He tried to nationalize the land and abolish the buying and selling of people and reform the currency several times in different directions. And while he was doing all this, the Yellow River, which had been building its own bed higher and higher above the plain for 1,000 years in its patient way, finally shrugged and changed course, and came out across the fields hundreds of miles from where it had been, and drowned the heart of his kingdom. Heaven, said everybody, has withdrawn the mandate. It is the oldest argument in the story, and it is unanswerable, because the river had in fact moved. The Jin lasted 14 years, and a distant cousin of the old imperial family put the Han back together in the year 25 and moved the capital east to Luoyang, and the second half of the dynasty, the Eastern Han, went on for another 2 centuries. A little quieter, a little more provincial, a little more in the hands of great landowning families, but recognizably the same country. And in the Eastern Han, around the year 105, a palace eunuch named Kai Lun presented the throne with an idea. People had been writing on strips of bamboo tied together with cord, which is heavy, so heavy that an emperor's daily reading was carried in on a cart, and on silk, which is light and lovely and costs more than the officials writing on it. What Kai Lun refined, and he probably did not invent it outright, but he made it work and he made it known, was a slurry of mulberry bark and old rags and fishing net and hemp, pounded and boiled and stirred in water until the fibres let go of each other and floated free, and then lifted out on a screen in a thin even film, and pressed and dried paper, cheap, light, patient paper, made of rubbish and water. It is the quietest revolution in this whole 4,000-year night, and it is my favourite, and it took 1,000 years to walk west across the world. Everything else in this story is loud. Paper simply arrived, and the world rearranged itself around it without ever mentioning what had happened. Every book afterwards, every letter, every exam, every printed page, every folded lantern, every kite, every promissory note, every window screen glowing amber from the inside on a winter evening, all of it comes off that screen, out of that vat, in that year, in a workshop that smelled of wet rags and boiled bark. Come down for a moment now from the emperors and the deserts, and look at how nearly everyone actually lived, because they lived like this for a very long time, and it is a restful thing to picture. A courtyard, 4 low buildings facing inward around a square of packed earth, walls of rammed loess, roofs of grey tile or thatch, a mulberry tree, because the women of the house keep silkworms, and the sound of a room full of silkworms eating is like soft rain that never stops. A vegetable plot. Hens, a pig, quite likely, sharing the arrangements more closely than one would choose. Inside, low tables and mats, because chairs have not arrived here yet and everyone kneels. A lacquer bowl, black and red, so beautifully made that we still dig them up gleaming, millet porridge in the north, rice in the south, pickles, a little pork on a festival day, wine that is more like beer, the smoke of pine and straw going up through the roof. an inkstone, if there is any ambition in the family, and a brush, and a boy being made to sit still and copy characters he does not yet understand. Outside, the fields and the tax grain going off in autumn in creaking carts, and the labour service owed to the state, a month a year, digging a canal, or mending a wall, or carrying something heavy somewhere else. And on the bluff above the Yellow River, in the doorway of one of those courtyard houses, a small oil lamp, burning as it burned when the Shang were casting bronze, and as it burned when the first emperor's carts went by. The dynasties rise, ripen, tire, and are replaced. The lamp is refilled. The farmer with the hoe goes out at first light and comes back at dusk, and could not tell you if you asked, and were rude enough to ask, whether he is living in a golden age. The Han thinned the way the Zhou had thinned, and the way, you will notice as the night goes on, they all do, which is slowly and from the inside. The great families grew larger estates and paid less tax. The small farmers, squeezed, sold their fields to the great families and became their tenants, so there were fewer taxpayers, so the tax went up on the ones who were left, who then sold their fields to the great families. Boy emperors came to the throne, and their mothers' families ran things, and to fight their mothers' families the boys used the eunuchs of the palace, and to fight the eunuchs the officials used the generals, and to fight everybody the generals used the army, which is generally where these arrangements end. And in the year 184 the countryside itself rose, in a great movement of Taoist healers and faith and desperation, whose followers tied yellow cloth round their heads, and are remembered as the Yellow Turbans. The rebellion was put down, the armies raised to put it down were not, and their generals looked around at the empire and saw quite clearly that nobody was really holding it. The Han ended formally in the year 220, when the last of its emperors handed the seal to a general's son, but it had been over for a while by then, in the way of these things. The way a house is empty for some time before anyone gets around to taking down the name at the gate. What came next is the most beloved period in Chinese history, and one of the least pleasant to have lived through, which is a combination that appears more than once tonight. 3 states settled out of the wreck, the Wei in the north on the old Yellow River plain, the Shu away in the west behind the mountains, and the Wu in the south along the Yangtze. 3 courts, 3 sets of ambitions, and about 60 years of a war that never quite finished. Cao Cao held the north, a poet and a brilliant administrator, and a man whose reputation has been argued about for 18 centuries. Liu Bei, a distant and threadbare relative of the fallen Han, held the west and had the better claim and the worse army. Sun Quan held the wet green south. And at Liu Bei's shoulder stood Zhi Liang, the strategist with the feather fan, the man who is to Chinese cleverness roughly what a lighthouse is to the coast, the fixed point everyone else's cleverness is measured against. Their great moment was at the Red Cliffs, in the year 208, on the Yangtze, where the fleet of the north was chained together for the comfort of soldiers who could not swim and was burned on the water by the south. And the wind, it is always said, blew from exactly the right direction at exactly the right time. Let us take it softly, from a great height, the way you would watch weather move across a valley, a long dark river, a great many boats. A red glow along the water, and by morning the north gone back to being the north. Battles look enormous from inside, and quite small from a hillside a mile away, and from 400 miles up, which is where we are tonight, they look like a change in the light. And here is the thing to keep in mind about the 3 kingdoms kindly. Almost everything you have ever heard about them. The oath in the peach garden, the borrowed arrows, the empty city, the loyalty, the fans, the horses with names, comes from a novel, and the novel was written more than 1,000 years afterwards, by a man with a genius for it, out of centuries of storytellers in tea-houses improving the material one afternoon at a time. It is one of the 4 great novels of the language, and it is magnificent, and it is roughly as reliable as a very good rumour. The rumour has outlived the facts by such a distance that the facts have more or less given up. The Wei absorbed the Shu, and then a general's family absorbed the Wei, and in the year 266 declared the Jin. and by 280 the Jin had taken the Wu and the country was, for a moment, whole. The moment lasted about a generation. The Jin princes fought one another with such thoroughness that they hired steppe horsemen to help, which is a thing that has never once worked, and in the early years of the 4th century the north fell to those horsemen and their cousins, and the Jin court and everyone who could afford a cart ran south across the Yangtze and set up again in the green wet country of the lower river. And then, for nearly 3 centuries, there were 2 Chinas. In the north, a long, patient succession of houses descended from the steppe ruled the Loess and the plain, and the greatest of them, the Northern Wei, did something nobody expected. They went native. They moved their capital south to Luoyang, they took Chinese names, they wore Chinese robes, they married Chinese families, they had their sons taught the classics, and within a few generations the conquerors were indistinguishable from the conquered, having been absorbed the way a river absorbs rain. This happens more than once in this story, and it is worth remembering when the Mongols and the Manchus come riding in on later nights, the civilization had a way of losing the war and winning the argument. In the south, the old families sat in their damp gardens and wrote poems and drank wine and practiced calligraphy, and looked down on absolutely everyone, and while they were doing it, they turned the wet rice south from a frontier into the richest half of the country. Refugees came down with their seed and their tools and their books. Dikes went up, paddies spread, the Yangtze world filled in. The politics of those 3 centuries were a shambles, court after short-lived court, and hardly one of them is worth your attention as you lie there in the dark. The politics failed noisily, everything else succeeded quietly, which is the usual arrangement, and almost never the one that gets written down. Because here is what was really happening in those 400 years, while the courts came and went like weather over a field. Buddhism arrived. It came the way everything came, along the road that the Emperor Wu had opened looking for horses, in bundles on camels, with the merchants, in the mouths of foreign monks who walked in through the western gates with the dust still on them. And at first it was an oddity, a foreign thing with foreign words, and the Chinese did what people do with a foreign thing, which is to explain it in terms of something they already have, so for a century or so the Buddha was discussed in the borrowed vocabulary of the Taoists, and everyone was slightly confused and perfectly happy. Then the Han fell, and the country broke, and it stayed broken. And generation after generation grew up knowing that the world does not hold, and a teaching that begins by saying, gently, that everything passes and that suffering comes from clinging to what is passing, found in that long division exactly the ground it needed. It went into the north, where the steppe rulers liked it because it was not the Confucianism of the officials who looked down on them. It went into the south, where the poets liked it because it was beautiful. It went into the villages, where people liked it because it offered mercy, and a next life, and a listening kindness. Monks went the other way, west, on foot, to India, over the mountains, to find the actual books and bring them back. Some of them died out there. Some of them came back after 15 years and spent the rest of their lives translating, which is a form of quiet heroism that never once gets a statue. And the enormous project of turning one civilization's holiest words into another civilization's language went on for centuries, and in the course of it the religion stopped being Indian and became Chinese, without anyone deciding on a day that it had. And they carved. Out at Yungang, up in the north, and later at Longmen near Luoyang, they cut into the living cliff and hollowed out cave after cave and carved Buddhas out of the rock, some of them small enough to hold in a hand, thousands of them, whole walls honeycombed with tiny seated figures, and some of them 50 and 60 feet high. Sitting in the hillside with their hands raised, looking out over the valley with an expression of such enormous and unbothered calm that 1400 years of politics have gone by underneath them without troubling it in the slightest. They are still there. They are there tonight, in the dark, with the frost on them, and in the same centuries, almost unnoticed, tea coming up from the south, at first as a medicine, then as a habit, then as the thing the whole civilization would drink and think about drinking. Porcelain, feeling its way towards itself in the kilns, potters pushing the fire hotter and the clay whiter, not yet arrived but getting there. Landscape painting. Beginning. The moment somebody first painted mountains not as the background for a story about people, but as the subject itself, with the people put in tiny, at the bottom, for scale. Which is a decision about the universe disguised as a decision about composition. The chair drifting in, on the road, from the west, so that eventually a country that had knelt for 2,000 years would sit down. And the writing going on, and on, and on, unbroken through all of it, the same characters the Shang had scratched on a shoulder blade, grown up now, brushed on paper, in the hands of a child in a courtyard being made to copy them out. 360 years, long enough that nobody alive could remember one country, long enough that it should have become permanent, the way the western half of another great empire, at almost exactly the same time and on the far end of those camel routes, was breaking into pieces that would never be one thing again. It did not. In the year 589, a northern general turned emperor named Yang Jian, whom the histories call the Emperor Wen, sent his armies down the Yangtze, and the last southern court folded, and the halves came back together after nearly 4 centuries apart. And what is remarkable, what is genuinely remarkable, and worth carrying with you into sleep, is how little anyone seems to have been surprised. There was no long argument about whether one country was the right idea. The writing had held, the histories had held, the classics had held, and the Buddhas in the cliffs looked out over both halves with the same face. Everyone had simply gone on assuming, for 360 years, through a dozen dynasties and more civil wars than are worth counting, that this was one country temporarily having a difficult time. And so it was one country again. The lamp on the bluff above the Yellow River was refilled that evening, as it had been refilled 10,000 evenings before. The farmer came in from the millet with dust on his shins, and the Sui, who had just done the impossible, were about to spend everything they had on a very long ditch full of water, but that is the next part of the night, and there is no hurry at all. The land was won again, and for a while almost nobody could quite believe it. After nearly 4 centuries in which the North and the South had kept separate courts and separate accounts and separate opinions about what a proper cup of tea ought to be, the two halves were sewn back together in 589, and the man holding the needle was a careful northern soldier named Yang Jian, who took the throne name Emperor Wen. He was not a romantic. He counted granaries. He liked lists. He rebuilt the law code into something shorter and gentler than what had come before it, which is not a sentence one gets to write very often about anybody, and he put the census back in order. Because a country that does not know how many people it has cannot possibly know how to feed them. He was frugal to a degree that his own court found slightly wearing. He wore plain clothes and remarked on the cost of things, and mended the ruined north with the patience of a man repairing a fence he expects to lean on for the rest of his life. Under him the examination idea took its first real breath, quietly, in an office somewhere. Without ceremony and without anybody thinking it important, the idea that a government might choose its officials by testing them, rather than by asking who their grandfather had been. Nobody at the time thought this was the most interesting thing happening. It was, more or less, the most important thing happening. And around him the country slowly exhaled. The soldiers went home. The grain moved. The bells in the monasteries rang out across a land that had one calendar again, and far away the farmer on the lowest bluff above the Yellow River, hoeing his millet in that fine yellow dust which lies over the whole north like flour spilled from a sack, thousands of years deep, noticed the change chiefly in that the tax collector now arrived from a slightly different direction. Then came his son Emperor Yang, and Emperor Yang wanted more. He was clever and restless and enormously ambitious, and he had inherited a full treasury, which is one of the more dangerous things a restless man can inherit. He looked at the map of his reunited country, and he saw the trouble in it immediately, the trouble that had been there from the beginning and would be there forever afterwards. The rice grew in the south, along the warm wet Yangtze, in green paddies under white morning mist. The power sat in the north, in the dry lowest country along the Yellow River and the Wey, where the armies were and the capitals were, and the horsemen on the grass beyond the frontier were. The rice was in one place, and the mouths were in another, and between them lay hundreds and hundreds of miles of hill and plain and stubbornness. So he dug. The Grand Canal was not a new idea. Exactly, there had been ditches and cuts and short local canals for centuries, useful in the way a footpath is useful. What Emperor Yang did was join them, and deepen them, and straighten them, and drive them through everything lying in between, until there existed a single continuous ribbon of quiet brown water running from the rice of the south to the granaries of the north, wide enough for laden grain barges, banked with willows, shadowed by roads. Furnished with post stations and lock gates and inspectors, and, at the imperial end of things, a dragon barge with a stern like a temple. Millions of people dug it. They dug it with baskets and mattocks and their hands, in the summer heat and in the winter mud, and a very great many of them died doing it, and this is one of those facts that ought to be said plainly, once, and then set down gently, and not turned over and over in the hand. The canal was a magnificent thing. It is still there. Barges are moving along parts of it tonight, low in the water, their laundry hanging out on lines, on water that was cut for them 1400 years ago by people who never heard of them and could not have imagined them. And the digging of it, together with 2 or 3 wars that did not go well and an expensive taste for enormous processions, used the Sui up completely. The dynasty that put the country back together and gave it its central artery lasted, in the end, 37 years. It fell in 618, exhausted, and the family that came in afterwards inherited a unified realm. A working canal, a working law code, a working census, and a road already paved to walk down. So it is only fair to say it kindly. The Sui built the road, and the Tang walked down it. History remembers the Sui roughly the way one remembers whoever set up the chairs. The Tang came in on a horse and stayed for nearly 300 years, and became the thing that everyone afterwards would mean when they said the word golden. It began, as these things so often begin, with a frontier general who saw which way the wind was blowing, a man named Li Yuan, who became Emperor Gaozu. And it truly began with his second son, Li Shimin, who took the throne as Emperor Taizong and ruled for 23 years from 626. He came to power in a way that was not tidy, and he then spent the rest of his life being so extraordinarily good at the work that later ages simply decided to look at the second part. He is the model ruler of the entire tradition, the one against whom every later emperor was measured and found a little short. He listened. That was the trick, and it sounds far too simple to be a trick. He kept on his own payroll officials whose whole function was to tell him he was wrong, and one of them in particular told him he was wrong for years, in detail, at length, in writing, and Taizong kept him on, and complained about him only in private, and when the man finally died the emperor said that he had lost a mirror. That is the tone of the early Tang. Confident, open, curious, unbothered, and secure enough to be corrected. And its heart was Chang'an. Try to see it, slowly, before you drift. A city laid out as a grid inside a rectangle of rammed earth walls, so regular that from above it looked like a page of ruled paper, more than 100 separate walled wards inside it, each ward a small town of its own with gates that shut at night. A great avenue running up the middle, so wide that a man on one side could not easily recognize a friend on the other. Perhaps 1 million people inside the walls, which made it, without any argument whatsoever, the largest city on the face of the earth. At dawn a drum sounded from the towers, and the ward gates opened, and the whole enormous grid began to move. At dusk the drum sounded again, 400 beats of it rolling out across the tiled roofs, and the gates swung shut, and the city subsided into 100 separate quiet neighbourhoods, with the streets between them empty and the moon coming up over all of it. In the 2 great markets, east and west, you could buy almost anything the world contained. Persians sold glass. Sogdians, those inexhaustible middlemen of the Silk Road, sold everything else and lent money on top of it. Turkish horsemen came in through the western gate, with the dust of the desert still grey on their coats and their camels' bells going. There were Koreans and Japanese in the capital, studying, taking notes to carry home. There were Indian monks and Arab traders and a Nestorian church, and a Zoroastrian temple, and a very great deal of wine. Tang women rode horses and played polo and wore their hair in high glossy loops, and in the little painted tomb figures we still have they look pleasantly plump and entirely unbothered. Buddhist monasteries stood among it all with their bells and their courtyards and their smell of incense and warm dust, rich, enormous, occasionally the largest landowners in a district, and a monk with a shaved head walked home through the evening with his empty bowl, while a camel train swayed past him going the other way. And in the ward offices and the ministries there were the examination halls, still modest, still only one road into government among several, but growing. Grain came up the Grand Canal to feed all of this, exactly as Emperor Yang had intended, and the willows on its banks grew old, and far to the north above the Yellow River the little oil lamp still burned in the doorway of a mud-walled courtyard house, and the family inside it had heard of Chang'an the way we have all heard of places we will never go. Into this open and confident world came the single most improbable career in the whole 4,000 years. A girl named Wu, the daughter of a timber merchant, entered the palace of Emperor Taizong as a junior concubine, a very minor rank, one of a great many. When he died, she was sent to a Buddhist convent to have her head shaved and be forgotten, which was the entirely standard ending of that story. It was not her ending. She came back into the household of the next emperor, Taizong's son Gaozong, and she rose, and rose, and when Gaozong's health began to fail, she was reading the memorials for him, and then answering them, and then, after his death, ruling through two of her own sons in turn, and then, in 690, declining to bother with sons at all, and taking the throne in her own name as emperor, not empress, Emperor Wu Zetian, the only woman in the whole enormous span of this story to do it. She ruled for 15 years. The historians who wrote about her afterwards were all men who found the plain fact of her personally distressing, so the record comes down to us thickly coated in horror stories. And some of them are true, and it was a court, and courts were not kind places, and she was not a kind woman in them. What is also true, and shouted rather less often, is that she governed well. She pushed the examinations harder than anyone before her, partly because officials who owed their place to a test owed it to her and not to their grandfathers. She was competent, tireless and shrewd, she chose good ministers, the granaries stayed full and the empire ran. She was eased off the throne in 705, an old woman, and died soon after, and she left instructions that her tomb tablet was to be left blank, so that later ages could write on it whatever they eventually concluded. Later ages have been arguing on that blank stone ever since. As gestures go, it is a rather magnificent one. And then the long golden afternoon that everybody means, the reign of Emperor Xuanzong, from 712, more than 40 years of it, the top of the Tang and the top of the whole tradition's memory of itself. In the early decades he was a serious and excellent ruler, hard-working and clear-eyed. And the empire filled out, and the granaries filled up, and the roads were safe from the sea to the deserts. In the later decades he grew tired of it, in the ordinary human way, and handed more and more of the work to other people, and fell deeply and famously in love with a consort named Yang Guifei, who was fond of lychees, which grew only in the far south, so that riders were sent galloping in relays for 1,000 miles to bring them north still cool, which is either the most romantic thing in this chapter or the clearest possible early warning sign, depending entirely on your mood. And in those years the poems happened. This is the part that lasted. Not the palaces which burned, not the armies which went home, not the treasure which was spent. The poems, Li Bai, who wrote about wine and moonlight and rivers and mountains and the deep pleasure of not having a job, who was too wild for the court and left it, or was gently pushed, and who drifted about the country writing lines so light they seemed to have cost him nothing at all, which is the hardest sort of line there is. Du Fu, who was his friend and very nearly his opposite, careful, compassionate, unlucky, chronically anxious about the price of grain, who watched his own children go hungry and wrote it down in language of such plain, terrible steadiness that reading him now is like being handed a letter. And Wang Wei, quieter than either, a painter as much as a poet, whose poems are mostly a hillside, some mist, an empty house, and the sound of somebody not being there. Between them they set the mark so high that the following 1200 years mostly stopped trying to beat it and settled for learning them by heart. Children in this civilization still learn Li Bai's lines about moonlight lying on the floor of a room and thinking of home before they can properly hold a brush. 1200 years. Consider that gently for a moment, and then let it go. Then, in 755, the Hinge. A frontier general named An Lushan, enormously fat, enormously charming, and enormously well supplied with soldiers, marched on the capital. The rebellion that carries his name ran for 8 years until 763, and it broke something. The emperor fled west into the mountains, and on the road at a dusty little post station, his own guards obliged him to give up Yang Guifei, and he did, and the poems written about that afterwards are among the saddest in the language. Chang'an was taken, and taken back. The census that followed recorded a fraction of the people the census before it had recorded, and how many of those millions died and how many merely stopped being counted is a question the historians have handled carefully ever since. The Tang did not fall. That is the thing to hold on to about the An Lushan rebellion. The dynasty survived it and went on for another 140 years, and there were good emperors afterwards and good poets afterwards, and the tea trade grew and the Arab ships came into Canton. But it never quite came back. It was the way a person recovers from a serious illness and is afterwards simply older. The same face, the same house, the same work. And something in the walk changed for good. Power slid outward to the provincial governors, who slowly stopped asking permission. The court turned inward and grew anxious. And meanwhile, quietly in the temple workshops, something was going on that mattered more than any of it. Woodblock printing. A page of characters cut in reverse into a smooth block of pear wood, inked, pressed, peeled off. Again and again and again, all afternoon, all week, 1,000 identical pages of a sutra where before there had been one copyist and a sore wrist. The oldest dated printed book in the world is a copy of the Diamond Sutra from 868, 7 sheets pasted into a scroll, and at the end of it there is a line recording who paid for it and why. A man had it made for free distribution, in memory of his parents. Somebody in 868 paid to have a book printed and given away for nothing so that his mother and father would be remembered. And it worked. Because here we are, in the dark, talking about him. The Tang ended in 907, quietly enough by the standards of these things, and there followed 53 years that the histories call the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms, which is a very tidy name for an extremely untidy time. 5 short northern dynasties in quick succession, 10 or so southern kingdoms overlapping each other, everybody printing their own money and calling themselves the real one. It is the single stretch of this story that even devoted readers tend to skim, and you have my permission to drift straight through it. Then, in 960, a general named Zhao Kuangyin was handed a yellow robe by his own troops, more or less firmly, and became Emperor Taizu of the Song, and the untidiness stopped. And here Taizu did the cleverest thing anybody does in this entire chapter. He knew precisely how he had got the throne, because he had got it the same way the last several men had got it, by being a general with loyal soldiers. So he invited his fellow generals to dinner. There was wine. There was, by every account, a very pleasant evening. And over the cups he observed, mildly, that a commander's life was a worrying one. that a man in such a position could never be entirely sure what his own soldiers might do to him one morning without asking first, and that a really sensible man might prefer a large estate, a fine house, a pension, a garden, and the excellent chance of dying in bed surrounded by grandchildren. And in the morning, one after another, they all resigned. Every single one of them. It remains the only military coup in the human record settled amicably over drinks, and it set the tone for the whole dynasty. The song would be run by men with books rather than men with horses, and this decision would work out beautifully for 300 years, and then, right at the very end, not at all. The northern Song capital was Kaifeng, and Kaifeng was not Chang'an. Chang'an had been a grid, a plan, an idea about order with a city living inside it. Kaifeng was a market that got out of hand, and it is much more like the cities we know. The ward walls came down and the shops came out onto the streets. There were restaurants open all night, and street food and coal smoke, because the north had begun burning coal on a serious industrial scale, and the iron the Song poured would not be matched in Europe for 600 years. There were fire brigades and hospitals and orphanages, and along the river the warehouses and the wine shops and the men mending boats. There is a painted scroll from those years, several yards of it, showing the city on a spring festival day. And a person can spend a whole afternoon walking along it, past the camels, past the fortune teller, past the man having a slow argument about a cart, and every single soul in it is doing something perfectly ordinary, and it is one of the most affectionate portraits any civilization has ever made of itself. And above the shops sat the scholar officials, and this is the Song's true invention. The examination system came into full flower now, anonymous marking, the papers recopied by clerks so that even a candidate's handwriting could not give him away, hall after hall of men shut in little cells for days with an inkstone and a lamp, and a road that ran, in theory and just often enough in fact, from a farmhouse to the Grand Council. A farmer's son with a good memory and a patient uncle could outrank a general. Not often, but often enough that everybody knew a story, and the stories did the work. The whole society tilted toward the book. A man's standing came from an examination, the examination came from the classics, and the classics were being thought through again from the ground up by the Neo-Confucians. Above all by Zhu Xi, who took the old plain sayings and built around them an entire philosophy of principle and matter and the investigation of things, and whose commentaries then became the syllabus for the next 700 years, which would have astonished him and would probably have made Confucius laugh. And the poets were officials too, and got posted to swamps for saying the wrong thing, and wrote about it cheerfully. Su Shi was exiled roughly as often as he was promoted, and from the mud he wrote about the moon, and about his brother, and about the river, and about pork, which he cooked very slowly with wine and sugar, and made so famous that people are still eating it under his name tonight. Now let the inventions go by slowly, one at a time, the way one counts sheep. Movable type, made around 1040 by a commoner named Bi Sheng, single characters in baked clay, set into an iron frame in a bed of warm resin, printed, then warmed again, so the characters fell loose to be used for something else entirely. The magnetic compass, known for ages as a curiosity for deciding where to put a house, now carried out onto the open sea, so that ships could hold their course in fog and go on sailing when the stars were gone. Gunpowder, cooked up by Taoist alchemists who were, with beautiful irony, looking for the elixir of long life, and packed into fire arrows and rockets and bombs lobbed over city walls. The world's first paper money, because the merchants of Sichuan had grown tired of hauling strings of iron coins about and began issuing receipts for them, and the receipts began circulating instead of the coins, and the government noticed and took the idea over. Money made of paper, 700 years before anybody else. Water-driven astronomical clock towers, 30 feet high, with gears and an escapement and small figures that came out and struck bells to mark the hours. Locks on canals. Watertight compartments in ship hulls. Inoculation against smallpox. landscape paintings on pale silk, in which enormous pale mountains rise into mist, and somewhere down at the bottom, if you look for them, there are two tiny travellers on a path, and the entire point of the painting is how small they are and how completely all right that is. Kilns turning out celadon the colour of rain-washed sky, tea whisked to a green froth, ink wet on paper in a quiet room in the rain. It is genuinely difficult to overstate the song. Nearly everything a person would put on a list of the things that made the modern world, this society already had in a rich, literate, commercial, coal-burning, sea-going, paper-shuffling civilization of 100 million people, and it had them centuries early. In 1127 a people from the northeastern forests, the Yurshan, who had lately made a state they called the Jin, came down and took Kaifeng and carried the emperor and his father and the whole court away into the cold. A younger son got across the Yangtze and set up again in the south, and the southern song ran from 1127 to 1279 from Hangzhou, which they insisted on calling Linyan, meaning temporary peace, and which they went on calling that for 150 years, because there is nothing on this earth quite so permanent as a temporary arrangement, and the southern song was, if anything, lovelier than what had gone before. Hangzhou sat on a lake with hills around it and willows along the causeways, and travellers who saw it in those centuries went away permanently unable to describe it, and permanently unable to stop trying. The sea trade boomed, and great junks with compasses and watertight bulkheads went to Java and India and the Arabian coast. The porcelain was the finest ever made. The paintings grew smaller and more perfect. And the whole thing sat there, rich and refined and reduced, with an enemy's border drawn across its old heartland and its old capital in somebody else's hands. And it lived like that for a century and a half, paying tribute, negotiating, holding on, being beautiful. Then, out on the grass beyond everything, a confederation of horsemen assembled itself under one man, and by the time the song understood what was happening the world already had a new shape. The urchin went first, then the west, then the south. The southern song held out against the Mongols longer than anybody else on earth managed. Decades of it, sieges and river war, and the last serious use of everything the song had ever invented, and in the end it did not matter. The most inventive society in the history of the planet, holder of the compass and the printing block and gunpowder itself, was outridden by men on horses. There is no lesson in that. It is simply what happened, and it should be said flatly and kindly, with no moral hung on it. In 1279 the last of the Song Court, which by then was a fleet, was cornered off the far southern coast at a place called Yarmen, and a loyal minister took the last emperor, who was a small boy of 7, up onto his back and went over the side into the sea. And a great many people followed them, and the dynasty ended in salt water. Then the sea was quiet. And that was the moment, in the whole length of this story, when for the very first time the entire country, north and south, millet and rice, the Yellow River and the Yangtze, was ruled from outside, by people who had come in from the grass. It had never happened before. There had been a foreign north, many times. There had never been a foreign everything. It felt, to the men in the examination halls, like the end of the world, and they wrote about it that way. It was not the end of the world. The Grand Canal went on carrying grain. The kilns went on firing. The characters on the page stayed the characters on the page, and the men who had come in on horses would discover, over the following century, that ruling this place has a way of quietly making you part of it. And far up in the north, above the wide, slow yellow river, in the doorway of a small courtyard house on a bluff of soft yellow dust, a little oil lamp was burning, the way it had burned when there were oracle bones, and when there were clay soldiers, and when there were poets. The wind came up off the water, the flame leaned, and steadied, and went on. Somebody inside turned over in the dark, and in the morning the farmer would be out on the terrace with his hoe, as his grandfather had been, and his grandfather's grandfather, and he had not changed the way he held it for any dynasty yet, and he was not going to start now. Tonight we come to the last 3 houses of the long story, and each of them. in its own quiet way, was entirely certain that it would stand forever, and none of them was in any hurry at all. We left the country in 1279, in the grey salt wind off the far southern coast, with the last little court of the song gone into the sea and the whole enormous land, for the first time in all of its long patient life, being governed from somewhere that was not itself. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, softly, the way you would sit with a fact that is too large to be alarmed by. 4,000 years of villages and bronze and ink and rice, of kings and emperors and scholars and clerks. And now the men who counted the taxes on the Loess and the rice on the Yangtze answered, in the end, to a family whose grandfathers had lived in felt tents on the grass, and who measured wealth in horses, and who had until very recently regarded a walled city as an obstacle rather than a home. And the astonishing thing, the thing this whole story keeps doing, is that within a generation the felt tents had a Chinese name, and a Chinese calendar and a Chinese capital laid out on a grid, and the taxes were counted much as they had always been counted, and the farmer on the yellow bluff above the river went on hoeing his millet, having noticed, at most, that the man who came for the grain now wore a different hat. The Mongols had come down out of the grasslands under Genghis Khan, who died in 1227, long before any of this settled, and who had never intended to found a dynasty of scholars and clerks. He had intended, as far as anybody can tell, simply to keep moving. But empires have a way of happening to people who only meant to travel. And it was his grandson, Kublai Khan, who did the settling, who looked at the enormous, wealthy, densely written civilization his family had spent half a century riding around in, and decided that the sensible thing was not to graze it, but to govern it. So in 1271, 8 years before the last Song Court went into the water, he took a Chinese name for his house out of the oldest of the Chinese books, and called it the Yuan, which carries the sense of an origin, a beginning, the first turn of something. It was, in its way, a very old trick performed by a very new man. He built his capital in the north, at a place he called Dadu, the great capital, and if you would like to know where it is, you have almost certainly seen a photograph of it. Because it is Beijing. From here on, for the rest of this story and past the end of it, the centre of gravity stays north, up where the plain runs out toward the passes and the cold comes down off the steppe in the winter with nothing in the way. Dadu was laid out the way a scholar would lay out an argument. Straight streets, square walls, gates in the proper places, a drum tower, a bell tower, water brought in and made into lakes. And because a great northern capital eats a very great deal of rice, and the rice grows in the south, Kublai did the one thing that every northern ruler of this land eventually does. He reached for the canal. The Grand Canal, dug by the Sui 6 centuries before and cursed at ever since, was extended and recut and dragged north, until the barges could come all the way up from the warm wet paddies to the cold dry capital, and the country was stitched together again along its wettest thread. It is a small, lovely, very Chinese fact that the Mongol conquest of China is remembered by most of the world for horses, and that one of its most durable achievements was a ditch. Under the Yuan, the country was sorted into ranks, tidily and without much apology, Mongols at the top, then the various Westerners and Central Asians who had come along with them, and who were useful for counting things. Then the northern Chinese, who had been under foreign rule for a while already, and were therefore considered halfway trustworthy. And then, at the bottom, the southerners, the people of the rich green song world, who were the most cultivated, the most numerous, the best educated, and the least trusted, which is a combination that tends not to age well. The examinations, that great ladder of the song, were suspended for decades, and the scholar officials who had spent their whole lives learning to climb it discovered that the ladder had been taken away and put in a shed. Some of them went home and painted bamboo. Some of them wrote plays instead, and this is the reason that Chinese drama, the great singing theatre with its painted faces and its long sleeves, flowers under the Mongols, a whole generation of the finest minds in the country, had their careers cancelled and, having nothing else to do with all that learning, wrote for the stage. There are worse ways for an injustice to end. Meanwhile, the roads across the whole width of Asia were, briefly and remarkably, safe. One family held the grass from the Yellow Sea to the edge of Europe, and where one family holds everything, a merchant can walk. Caravans went out and came back. Silk and porcelain and paper went west, and glass and silver and strange faces came east. And a young Venetian named Marco Polo either did or did not travel the whole of that road and spend 17 years in the service of the Great Khan, and either did or did not see the paper money and the burning black stones and the city of 10,000 bridges, and either did or did not dictate the whole account years later to a romance writer he was sharing a prison cell with. Nobody has ever entirely settled it. He never mentions the writing, or the tea, or the wall, which is a strange set of things to forget. It has not stopped a single person reading him for 700 years, and it will not stop them tonight. Take from it whatever you like, and drift a little on the thought of a man walking, at the speed of a walking man, from a lagoon in Italy to a lake in Beijing, month after month after month, with the dust of half the world on his boots. But the yuan, for all its size, was thin. Fewer than 100 years after Kublai took the south, the accounts were in confusion. The paper money had been printed until it meant almost nothing, which is a lesson that every civilization apparently has to learn for itself, and the plague came through, and the weather turned bad, and then the Yellow River did what the Yellow River does. It had been silting up its own bed higher and higher above the fields, the way it always does. And in the middle of the 14th century it shrugged out of that bed and went looking for the sea somewhere else entirely, drowning a great deal of the plain on its way. The court, sensibly and disastrously, conscripted enormous gangs of men to dig it back, and a very large number of hungry, angry, well-organised men standing in a muddy trench together turned out to be exactly the wrong thing to assemble in a country that had run out of patience. They wound red cloth around their heads. The red turbans rose, and then everyone rose, and in 1368 the Yuan court did the one thing it had always been able to do, which was to get on its horses and ride home to the grass. They went on being Khans up there for a long time afterwards, and looking down at the wall, and the wall, as we shall see, took the hint. Out of that mud came the least likely emperor in the whole of this long story, and possibly the least likely in anybody's. Zhu Yanchang was born in a poor family of tenant farmers, and when he was a boy a famine and a plague came through his district, and took his father and his mother and his eldest brother inside a single month, and he had no money to bury them. A neighbour gave him a scrap of ground. He went to a monastery, because monasteries fed people, and then the monastery ran out of food too, and sent its novices out with begging bowls, and so for several years the future emperor of all China walked the roads of the ruined middle of the country with a bowl in his hands, learning it by heart. He joined the Red Turbans. He turned out to be very good at it, and in 1368 the boy with the begging bowl walked into the capital and became the Hongwu Emperor, the founder of the Ming, which means the bright, the radiant. There is no steeper climb recorded anywhere on earth. It did not make him a comfortable man. He was suspicious, sleepless, tireless, and permanently convinced that somebody in the room was cheating him, which in fairness, somebody in the room usually was. He abolished the office of Chancellor entirely rather than share power with one, and thereby handed himself and every Ming emperor after him a workload that no human being could carry, and which most of them, in the end, simply put down. He wrote instructions to his people in plain, blunt farmer's language that scholars found embarrassing and everyone else could actually understand. He drove out the Mongol dress and the Mongol names, restored the examinations, and rebuilt the whole apparatus of the scholar official as though it had merely been in storage, which, more or less, it had. And he moved through his own palace like a man who could not quite believe that the guards were for him. His capital was Nanjing, in the south on the Yangtze, the southern capital, which is exactly what the name says. But his son had other ideas. The Yongle Emperor took the throne in 1402, and Yongle is one of those reigns that rearranges the furniture of a civilization for the next 500 years. He looked north, to where he had spent his own career as a frontier prince watching the steppe, and he decided that a country whose enemies come from the north should have its emperor sitting where he can hear them coming. So the capital went north to the old Mongol Dadu and was rebuilt and renamed and became Beijing, the northern capital, and there it has stayed ever since. And in the middle of it, between 1406 and 1420, he raised the Forbidden City. It is difficult to make a building sound restful and enormous at the same time, but the Forbidden City is both. Nearly 1,000 buildings, inside one long wall, inside a moat, laid out along a single straight line running from south to north. Gate, courtyard, hall, courtyard, hall, courtyard, hall, so that a visitor did not so much enter it as be admitted through it, one enormous quiet space at a time, with the halls getting no less grand and the visitor getting steadily less so. The roofs are yellow, because yellow was the emperor's colour and nobody else's. The timbers are red, the columns are whole trees floated up the canals from the forests of the far southwest, because there were no trees left near Beijing big enough to hold up a roof of that size. Every measurement is a statement. The whole thing is aligned on the axis of the world, and it is saying, calmly and without raising its voice, that this is the middle of everything, and that everything else is arranged around it in a series of rings, getting less important as it goes. Whether or not that was true is beside the point. It was built to be true, and for a while it very nearly was. And in the same years, out on the water, the Ming did the single most surprising thing anyone in this entire story ever does. The Yongle Emperor gave a fleet to a man named Zheng He, an admiral, a Muslim, a eunuch, taken as a boy from the far southwestern hills, when the Ming armies came through, raised at court, grown into a very large and very capable man, who somehow ended up in charge of more tonnage than the rest of the world put together. From 1405 he took the treasure fleets out, 7 times over the next 30 years, hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men, and at the heart of them the treasure ships themselves, so large that people spent the next several centuries arguing that the figures must be wrong, with 9 masts and watertight compartments, and a stern rudder the size of a small house. Europe would not put anything comparable on the sea for a very long time indeed. They went south to the Spice Islands, and west to Ceylon, and onto the coast of India, and to Hormuz, and to the ports of Arabia, and down the eastern shore of Africa, and they came back with envoys and tribute and ostriches and zebras and, on one occasion, a giraffe, which the court examined with great seriousness and pronounced to be a killin, a heavenly beast that appears only in the reign of a truly virtuous ruler. In fairness to everyone involved, a giraffe walking up the steps of the Forbidden City is doing an extremely convincing impression of a heavenly beast. And then, quite calmly, it stopped. The voyages cost an enormous amount and brought back giraffes. The real danger was on land, in the north where it had always been. The treasury had a wall and a canal and a new capital to pay for, and the scholar officials, who had never liked the eunuchs and liked the expense less, put the argument in writing and won it. The ships were left at their moorings, the shipyards went quiet, the records of the voyages were, it is said, quietly lost, and the largest fleet on the face of the earth simply softened into the mud of its own harbour, decade by decade, while on the other side of the world, some very much smaller ships were being fitted out by people who could not have imagined what they had just been handed. It is easy to be theatrical about this, and there is no need. It was not a tragedy, it was a budget. Every country on earth has at some point decided that the sea was a hobby it could not afford, and most of them were right. The land, meanwhile, got the money instead, and the land got a wall. This is the point in the story to say the thing that ought to be said gently but firmly. The great wall that you are picturing right now, the grey stone spine with the square watchtowers going away over the ridges into the mist, is Ming. It is not the first emperor's. His was rammed earth, and mostly gone, and a long way further north. The Ming, with the Mongols still up on their grass and still perfectly capable of coming back, spent the better part of 2 centuries rebuilding the northern frontier in brick and cut stone. Tower after tower after tower, running it along the tops of the mountains where the going was worst. Because a wall on a ridge is a wall that only has to be climbed by somebody who has already climbed a mountain. It was never a single unbroken thing, and it never really kept anyone out, and both of those facts have been pointed out so many times that pointing them out has become its own small tradition. What it did was slow people down, and give the beacon fires somewhere to stand, and give the soldiers a road along the top to walk. Picture them tonight if you like. 2 men on a tower in the cold, a brazier, a kettle, a very long view, and absolutely nothing happening. For years. That was the wall most of the time. Think of the bricks, if you would like something slow to think about. Each one made of river mud and straw, pressed in a wooden mould, dried in the sun, fired in a kiln, stamped with the name of the kiln that made it so that a bad brick could be traced back to the man who had made it, and then carried up a mountain on somebody's back, or on a donkey, or by a very patient goat, and set down in mortar mixed, so the old story goes, with rice. Millions of them, one at a time, up a mountain for 200 years, and down in the kilns of the south, in a town of 1,000 furnaces, the Ming made the other thing the world remembers them for. White porcelain painted in cobalt blue, thin and hard and ringing, dragons and lotuses and grapevines, packed in straw and rice and sent out in ships to every court on earth, until people in damp northern countries with no idea where it came from began to call any fine. Plate by the name of the place itself, and the word settled into the English language and sits there still, in a cupboard, being taken out at holidays. But the Ming grew tired, the way every house in this story grows tired. Emperors stopped attending. One of them refused to hold court for decades and simply let the machine run without him, which it did, in a manner of speaking. Silver came in from the mines of the far side of the world and the tax was moved on to silver, and then the silver stopped coming and the tax stayed where it was. The weather turned cold, genuinely, measurably cold, all across the northern half of the planet, and the harvests failed, and the rebels came, and the soldiers were not paid. And in 1644, on a grey morning, with a rebel army in his streets, the last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, walked out of his palace and up the little wooded hill just behind it, the hill made of the earth dug out of his ancestors' moat, and hanged himself from a tree. He was, by every account, a hard-working and conscientious man who had been handed a situation that could not be worked hard enough. The dynasty of the boy with the begging bowl had lasted 276 years, which, as these things go, is a long life. And then the last house came in through the pass. The Manchus were a people of the forests and rivers of the far northeast, beyond the wall, in the cold country of pine and sable and long winters. Nerichi had spent his life gathering the scattered clans into something that could act as one thing, and his son Hong Taiji had given it a state, a script, an army organised into banners of coloured cloth, and a new name, and they had been looking thoughtfully at the wall for a generation. What let them through was not a siege. It was a general, a Ming general at the eastern end of the wall, holding the pass with the last good army in the empire, who woke up to find that his emperor was dead, his capital was in the hands of a rebel, and his choices were both bad. He chose the Manchus. The gate opened, and the banners came down through it, and they beat the rebels, and then, in the way of these things, they did not leave. The Shunzi emperor was carried into Beijing in 1644, a small boy on a very large throne, and the Qing settled into the Forbidden City, almost without changing the furniture, and stayed for 268 years. They kept nearly everything: the examinations, the ministries, the Confucian classics, the rites, the calendar, the whole enormous humming apparatus of the scholar official. All of it went on almost exactly as before, because it worked, and because a very small foreign house ruling a very large old civilization cannot afford to look like an interruption. What they required in return was the queue. Every man was to shave the front of his head and wear the rest in a single long braid down his back, in the Manchu style, and this was not a fashion note, it was a signature. Renewed every few weeks for 2.5 centuries, on the top of every head in the empire, It was resisted bitterly at first, and then, as such things are, it became simply what a man's head looked like, so completely that by the end, when it was finally cut off, people mourned it. The Qing spent their whole run walking a fine line, with great skill and no rest, Manchu enough to keep their own army and their own homeland and their own language, and Chinese enough to be, in every ceremony that mattered, more properly Confucian than the Confucians, sacrificing at the right altars on the right mornings in the right robes, patrons of the classics, examiners of scholars, and the most conscientious emperors the throne had seen in centuries. It is one of the quiet ironies of the story that the last dynasty was the one that took the tradition most seriously, in the way that people who have just joined a family are often the ones who remember all the birthdays. And they produced, one after another, 3 of the finest rulers in the whole 4,000 years. The Kangxi Emperor came to the throne as a child and sat on it for 61 years, which remains the longest reign in this long history. He was curious the way water is wet. He read everything, he travelled constantly, south and north and out into the grass, because he did not believe you could govern a country you had only seen on paper. He hunted. He shot. He learned Latin and geometry and algebra from Jesuit priests who had come halfway around the world to convert him, and who ended up mostly drawing him maps and correcting his calendar, which is a fair summary of how that entire encounter went. He put the empire's finances in order, settled the south, took the great island in the southeast, held the northern border, and commissioned a dictionary of the whole written language, which still carries his name. He also, near the end, spent 20 exhausting years watching his own sons manoeuvre over the succession, which is the one problem that no amount of geometry has ever solved. His son, the Yongzheng Emperor, ruled only 13 years and worked, by all accounts like a man being chased. He read memorials until the small hours and wrote comments back on them in vermilion ink in his own hand, tens of thousands of them, some of them affectionate, most of them exact. He reformed the taxes, cleaned out the corruption his father had grown too tolerant to see, and built the small inner council that actually ran the empire thereafter. He is the least loved of the 3, and possibly the reason the other 2 look so good. And then the Qianlong Emperor, who took the throne in 1735 and held it for 60 years, and who was determined not to reign one day longer than his grandfather Kangxi, out of respect, and so, at exactly 60 years, he abdicated with immense ceremony and handed the throne to his son, and then quietly went on running everything for another 3 years anyway, from the room next door, which is the most elegant compromise between filial piety and not letting go that anyone has ever arranged. Under him the empire reached its greatest size, out west across the deserts and the mountains and the grass, larger than it had ever been under anyone, and its greatest population and its greatest confidence. The great libraries were copied out by hand, a project so vast that the copying took thousands of scholars' years, and, since the copyists were also reading, a certain number of books they disapproved of quietly failed to be copied, which is censorship performed with a brush and no noise at all. The gardens went up outside the city, water and rock and willow and pavilion, arranged so that no view ever showed you everything at once. The porcelain got so technically perfect that it stopped being interesting, which is a hazard, and the whole thing hummed, enormous and rich and calm and old, absolutely convinced, with 3,000 years of evidence that it was the centre and that the rest of the world was an edge. And then, in 1793, some ships arrived, and a man named Macartney came up from the coast with 600 cases of presents. He had been sent by a small wet island on the far edge of the world to ask, politely, for regular trade, and an embassy in the capital, and a port or 2. He brought clocks and telescopes and globes and a planetarium and a hot air balloon and cannon, all chosen to demonstrate that his country was worth talking to. There was a long, courteous, exceedingly awkward business about whether he would kneel in the proper way, which has been written about far more than it deserves. And in the end, Qianlong, then 82 years old and entirely serene, sent a letter home, and the letter explained, with real kindness and not a trace of malice, that the Celestial Empire possessed all things in prolific abundance within its own borders and had no need whatever of the manufactures of outside barbarians. And here is the thing that makes that sentence worth saying softly and then leaving alone. At that moment, it was true. Very nearly everything the world wanted was made here. The trade ran one way, the silver came in and stayed. The clocks were charming and went into a cupboard. It was an accurate description of the world as it had been for a very long time, written down at almost the exact hour when the world stopped being like that, and it is one of those sentences that ages very badly indeed, not because the man who wrote it was foolish, but because he was describing a tide at the precise moment of its highest water, when the sea is perfectly still and looks as though it has decided to stay. So let us leave them there, at the top. In 1799 the Qianlong Emperor died, full of years, in a full empire, in a warm room in the middle of the largest and richest state on earth, with the libraries copied, and the borders quiet, and the grain moving up the canal, and the porcelain going out, and nothing, anywhere, visibly wrong. Far to the south, in a courtyard house on the yellow bluff above the river, a red paper lantern was burning in a doorway, as it had burned through the Mongols and the Ming and the Manchus and every other arrangement of hats, and the millet was drying on the roof, and the river went on carrying its endless yellow freight past in the dark, exactly as it had 4,000 years before. Nothing had happened. Nothing was happening. The tide was simply at its very top, perfectly level, entirely calm, and had begun, without a sound, and without anyone in that enormous quiet country noticing at all, to turn. The old emperor died in the first month of the year 1799, in the deep grey cold of a Beijing winter, in a warm room hung with silk and heated by charcoal braziers, having lived 88 years and having ruled, one way and another, for more than 60 of them. He died full of years, in a full empire, and nothing whatsoever went wrong. That is worth saying slowly and gently, because it is the last time in this long story that we will be able to say it quite so easily. The Qing at that moment held more land than any house before them had ever held, and more people than any state anywhere on earth. The granaries were mostly full. The kilns at Jingdezhen were burning day and night, turning out blue and white by the shipload. The great libraries had been copied out by hand, character by character, in quiet rooms where the only sounds were brush on paper and the occasional polite cough. The Grand Canal carried grain north the way it had carried grain north for 1,000 years, the barges nose to tail, the water brown and slow and patient. And the tide, which had been coming in for 4,000 years, had reached its very top, and had begun, without any noise at all, and without anyone in that warm silk room noticing, to go quietly back out. Nothing announced it. Tides never do. The turning of a tide is the least dramatic event in nature. It is simply that the water, which was arriving, is now leaving, and it does this so slowly that you can stand in it for an hour and not be sure. So let this chapter be an evening rather than a fall. Let it be the hour when the light goes long and gold and then blue, and the lamps are lit one by one along a street, and somebody somewhere is folding away the day's work. There is sadness in it, and we will not pretend otherwise. But we are not going to hurry through the sadness or lean on it, because that is not what we do here. And because you are trying to sleep, we will say the hard things once, quietly, and then walk on. The trouble, when it came first as arithmetic, which is the least frightening way for trouble to arrive, and the hardest to argue with. In the long calm of the 1700s, with peace across the whole empire and new crops from across the sea, the sweet potato and the maize and the peanut, which would grow on the poor dry hillsides where rice and millet would not, the number of people in China had roughly doubled, and then gone on climbing. Perhaps 150 million at the start of the Qing, perhaps 300 million by the year Qianlong died, and every one of them wanting a bowl of something. There was no more good land. The hillsides were terraced up to the tree line and then above it. The fields were divided among sons and divided again, until a family's holding was the size of a decent garden and had to feed 9 people. A farmer on the lowest bluff above the Yellow River, hoeing his millet as his family had hoed millet since before there were dynasties to keep track of, found that the same field that had comfortably fed his grandfather now fed him thinly, and would feed his own sons thinly indeed. Nothing had failed, nothing had been mismanaged. There were simply more people, standing in the same amount of sunlight. And the government, which had been built to run an empire of 150 million with a few tens of thousands of officials, went on running an empire of 300 million with roughly the same few tens of thousands of officials, because that was the number in the book, and nobody had written a new book. The other half of the trouble came in by sea, and it began, of all the unlikely things, with tea. The British had discovered tea, and had gone so thoroughly and so hopelessly in love with it, that by the end of the 1700s they were drinking it by the tens of millions of pounds a year, and every single leaf of it came from China. They also wanted silk. They also wanted porcelain, so badly that the word for the country became the word for the plate, and China, as the courteous letter to Lord Macartney had explained in 1793, wanted nothing much in return, possessing all things already within its own borders, which was true at the time, and remains one of the most quietly devastating sentences ever written by a man who is entirely correct. So the British paid in silver. Ships came east loaded with silver and went home loaded with tea, and the silver stayed, and the tea was drunk, and for a while everybody was reasonably content except the men in London who had to keep finding the silver. And then somebody had an idea, and it was a bad one, and it worked. In the poppy fields of Bengal there grew a thing that people would buy without being persuaded, that they would buy again next week without being reminded, and that they would go on buying long after they had stopped wanting to. Opium had been known in China for centuries as a medicine, taken in small amounts mixed with other things, unremarkable, smoked in a pipe, mixed with tobacco. It was something else entirely. Chests of it began to move east, first a few hundred a year, then a few thousand, then tens of thousands, unloaded at anchorages below Canton onto fast local boats with too many oars, sold by men who were very careful never to be seen carrying it themselves. And the silver, which had flowed into China for 200 years, turned around in the harbour and began flowing out. It is a strange thing to say of a trade that ruined so many lives, but the arithmetic was the part the court noticed first. The price of silver rose, which meant that taxes, which were reckoned in silver, rose, which meant that the farmer on the lowest bluff, who had never seen an opium pipe and never would, paid more each year for reasons no one could explain to him. That is usually how these things reach the people they hurt most, sideways as a number, with no one to blame in the room. In the year 1839 the Emperor sent a man south to stop it, and the man he sent was almost certainly the best man he had. Lin Zexu was an official of the old kind, the kind the whole examination system had been built to produce over 1300 years. A scholar, incorruptible to the point of inconvenience, hard-working, humane, and entirely tragically certain that a wrong this obvious would give way once it was properly explained. He went to Canton. He studied the problem the way he would have studied a classic, gathering reports, interviewing merchants, reading translations of foreign newspapers, which was more than most people on either side bothered to do. He confiscated the chests, some 20,000 of them, more than 1,000 tons, and rather than burn them, which would have wasted them profitably into the air, he had great trenches dug by the shore and the opium broken up and mixed with lime and salt water and flushed out with the tide, and it took his men 23 days. And he wrote a small apology to the spirit of the sea for the mess. That detail is not decoration. It tells you exactly what kind of man was standing on that beach, and exactly how little it would help. What followed was not really a war in any sense that would have been recognised at Muet or at Red Cliffs. It was a demonstration. A handful of ships came, one of them an iron steamer that could go where it liked regardless of the wind, which was the entire point and which nobody on the Chinese side had any answer to at all. They went up the rivers, they went up the coast, they took the forts, and they cut the Grand Canal, which was the empire's spine, and once the grain barges stopped, the argument was over. The Treaty of Nanking was signed on a warship in 1842. It gave the island of Hong Kong to Britain. It opened 5 ports. It fixed the tariffs so that China could not set its own. It required an indemnity, and it required, in a clause that stung longer than any of the money, that the two countries deal with each other as equals, which sounds fair, and was, and which meant that the oldest state on earth had just been informed of its own size by strangers with better boats. Lin Zexu, who had done everything right, was blamed and sent into exile in the far northwest, where he made himself useful digging irrigation canals, because that was simply the kind of man he was. It was the first of the treaties that everyone would come to call unequal, and it would not be the last, and the century that followed was, for this civilization, the hardest it had ever had. We are going to say the hardest part of it now, once, quietly, and then we are going to move gently past, because the worst thing that happened in these years was not the foreigners at all. In the hills of the far south there lived a village schoolteacher named Hong Xiuquan, who sat the imperial examinations 4 times and failed them 4 times, and who fell into a long fever after the 3rd failure and dreamed. Years later, reading a Christian tract he had been handed in the street, he decided the dream had been an explanation, that he was the younger brother of Jesus, sent to sweep the demons out of China. Ordinarily, such a man is remembered kindly by his neighbours and by nobody else. But he spoke to people who had nothing, in a place where a great many people had nothing, and they came. And there were hundreds, and then thousands, and then a marching kingdom with an army and a capital at Nanjing, and its own calendar and its own laws, and it lasted 14 years, from 1850 to 1864, and it took the richest half of the empire. And when it was finally put down, field by field and city by city, perhaps 20 million people were dead. And perhaps 30. It is one of the deadliest wars in the whole human record. There is no way to make that sentence smaller, and there is no reason to make it larger, and we will leave it there, on the ground, with respect, and go on. Only this, because it belongs to our story, the man who nearly ended the empire was a man the examination hall had turned away. The ladder that had held the whole thing together for 13 centuries, the promise that a nobody who studied might govern, had, on this one occasion, dropped somebody, and he had got up and walked to Nanjing. While that was happening in the south, the ships came back. The Second Opium War ran from 1856 to 1860, and it ended in the autumn of 1860. When British and French troops reached Beijing and found, a little way outside the walls, the Yuan Mingyuan, the summer palace, which was not a palace but a garden the size of a small country. 150 years of emperors quietly adding to it, lakes with islands, marble bridges, halls of cedar, a European folly with fountains built by Jesuits for Qianlong's amusement, libraries, scroll rooms, clocks, jade, a working model of a whole village where the court could pretend to be ordinary people for an afternoon. They looted it for 2 days, and then, on an order, they burned it. And it burned for 3 days, and the smoke lay over the northwest of Beijing and drifted down onto the roof tiles, and the ash came down on the lake like grey snow. 3 days, 150 years of quiet accumulation, of one emperor after another saying that this corner needed a pavilion, gone in 3 days, and the ruins are still lying there, and people walk among them on Sunday afternoons. The court, which had left before the soldiers arrived, understood at last that something had changed in the world, and it did what a competent old institution does, it decided to learn. The self-strengthening years were sincere, intelligent, expensive, and not quite enough. Arsenals were built at Shanghai and Fuzhou. Shipyards, a steam navy, bought and partly built. Telegraph wire went up along the roads, and the first lines were pulled down again by villagers who were reasonably sure it was interfering with the wind and water of their ancestors' graves, and who may or may not have had a point, but who certainly had a shovel. Boys were sent across the sea to study engineering, and came home with foreign haircuts, and were not entirely trusted afterwards. Coal was dug, a railway was laid, and brought back, and torn up, and laid again. It was all real, and it was all done by serious men, and the deep difficulty was one nobody could quite say out loud, that you cannot buy a century wholesale. You can buy the guns. You cannot buy the school that made the man who made the gun, or the bank that lent him the money, or the arguing that produced the bank. And over all of it, for close to half a century, sat one small woman behind a screen of yellow silk. Cixi, said roughly Tzu Chi, had entered the palace as a junior concubine, had had the one son who lived, and by the accident of that son's birth, and that son's early death, and a nephew's convenient youth, found herself running the empire from behind her screen, because a woman could not sit on the throne, but there was nothing whatever in the rules about sitting behind it. She ruled in effect from 1861 until she died in 1908. She was shrewd, and she was watchful, and she was very good at the one thing that keeps a person in that room for 47 years, which is knowing who is about to become a problem. She has been blamed for everything which cannot be right, and forgiven nothing which also cannot be right. The story everyone tells is the marble boat, that she took the Navy's money and spent it on a stone pleasure barge that sits in the lake at the Summer Palace to this day, unable to float, unable to sink, entirely useless and rather beautiful. It is not quite fair, and the accounting is muddier than the story, and the story is far too good to have died, and so it has not. In 1894, the new Navy went to war with Japan, which had begun its own modernizing a generation before, and had gone about it with unnerving thoroughness, and in a single year the fleet was gone. That defeat cut deeper than any of the Europeans had, because Japan was not a stranger from the far side of the world. Japan was the neighbour who had learned to read from Chinese books, and had gone away, and had come back holding something new. In 1898 the young emperor tried, for 100 days, to reform everything at once, schools, exams, the army, the ministries, and it lasted, as the name suggests, 100 days, and then he lived out his life quietly on an island in a lake in his own palace, which is a very Chinese way of being disagreed with. And in 1900 came the Boxers, young men from the drought struck north who practiced a boxing they believed would turn bullets aside, and who were wrong about that in the way that people who have nothing left are sometimes wrong, and the court, exhausted and cornered, backed them, and 8 foreign armies came to Beijing, and it ended as such things end, with an indemnity so large it was still being paid off long after everyone who signed it was dead. Now the end, and we will take it slowly, because it is not a crash, and it should not be told as one. In 1905 the imperial examinations were abolished. Not overthrown, not stormed, abolished, by a memorial with a stroke of a brush, because the new schools needed the room, and the old degrees no longer led anywhere useful. 1300 years. From about 605 under the Sui, all the way to 1905, the hall of little brick cells, the sealed papers, the candidates copying out the classics from memory with numb fingers, the old men of 60 sitting the same exam as boys of 18, the ladder that a farmer's son with a good memory could climb until he outranked a general. It had been the central drama of this civilization, the thing that made it unlike anywhere else, the reason the man who governed a county was a poet and not a knight. And one morning it simply was not there, and the cell stood empty, and the grass came up through the floors. And somewhere a young man who had spent 11 years memorizing the odes discovered that he had a beautiful, useless skill. That, more than any treaty, is where the old world actually ended. Cixi died in 1908, one day after the emperor she had kept on his island, which is the sort of coincidence that historians are obliged to note and decline to explain. Before she went, she named the next emperor, and he was 2 years old. His name was Puyi. They took him from his home at night, in the cold, in a sedan chair, screaming, and carried him into the forbidden city, and put him on a throne so large that a grown man had to crouch behind it to keep him from wriggling off during the ceremony. He was the 10th Qing emperor, and the last emperor of anything, and he was 2. The rest happened almost by accident. On the 10th of October, 1911, in the city of Wuchang on the Yangtze, a bomb went off prematurely in a house where some soldiers were making bombs, and the police came, and the soldiers, having no remaining choice, mutinied that night, and then the province next door declared for them, and then the next, and within 6 weeks most of the south had simply stopped being part of the empire. Without much fighting, the way a wall that has been rained on for 80 years comes down in an afternoon. Sun Yat-sen, a doctor who had spent most of his adult life abroad raising money for exactly this, and had missed the actual event entirely, being in Denver at the time and reading about it in a newspaper, came home. A republic was proclaimed on the first day of 1912. And on the 12th of February, 1912, in the Hall of Mental Cultivation, an edict of abdication was issued in the name of the Emperor Puyi, aged 6, and signed with the seal on his behalf by the woman looking after him. Because he could not write and had not been told what was happening, and would not understand it for years. He was allowed to keep the inner court for a while, so he went back out into the courtyard to play. 2,132 years, from the first emperor standing alone in his new title with his clay army already being moulded, all the way down to a small boy with a kite and a bicycle he would later learn to ride along the palace walls, and it ended not with a crash, but with a child being called in from the courtyard for his supper. The oldest continuous political idea on earth, the throne that you the Great is supposed to have made necessary by digging channels for the flood, went out the way a lamp goes out when nobody trims the wick. And here we stop the chronology. We are going to stop the way you set down something old and heavy, carefully, with both hands, and then we are going to stand back and look at what 4,000 years actually left behind, which is the part that matters and the part that is still here. Because the thing to understand, lying there in the dark, is that nothing ended. The dynasties were only the weather. The civilization was the climate. The Shang came and went, and the Zhou came and went, and the Qin lasted 15 years, and the Han and the Tang and the Song and the Yuan and the Ming and the Qing all rose, ripened, tired, and were replaced, and nearly every one of them announced on arrival that it would stand for 10,000 years. And not one of them made it to 1,000, and the whole time, underneath, the land went on being the land, and the people went on being the people, and the rain went on running off the curved grey roof tiles into the courtyard the way it does tonight. Consider the writing. A scratch on an ox shoulder blade at Anyang, 3,500 years ago, asking whether the harvest will be good, or whether the king's toothache means an ancestor is annoyed, and a character on a page printed this morning. And the two of them are recognisably relatives, not identical. Relatives, you can see the family knows. Nothing else on earth has held on that long. Every other script of that age is either dead or so changed that only specialists can find the join. Egypt's hieroglyphs are read by scholars, these are read by children, on the way to school on a sign about a bus. Consider the things that went out. Paper, out of Kailan's vats of mulberry bark and rag and water, went west along the caravan roads, and became every book in every language, including the one you last fell asleep holding. Printing went out, the compass went out onto every sea, and pointed the ships of other countries towards continents the men who invented it had no interest in. Gunpowder went out, and rearranged the whole of somebody else's history. Silk went out, and was believed for centuries to grow on trees. Tea went out, and became, in a damp island on the other side of the world, an entire personality. Porcelain went out until the country's name was sitting in a cupboard as the word for a plate, which is the softest immortality any civilization has ever been granted, to be a thing people eat off, every day, without ever once thinking of you. Consider what is still standing tonight. The Grand Canal is carrying barges at this moment, in the dark, 1,400 years after the Sioux dug it and used themselves up doing it. The Great Wall is on its ridges under the same moon, the Ming brick and the Ming watchtowers, empty, doing nothing at all, extremely good at it. The clay soldiers are in their ranks at Lintong, every face different, waiting on a first emperor who did not need them, and who could not, in the end, buy the one thing he actually wanted. The Forbidden City is sitting in the middle of Beijing with its 900 and some buildings and its yellow tiles, and the little boy who is allowed to keep it as a very large toy has been gone a long time, and it is full of people photographing the doorknobs. And the exam hall is gone, and the exam hall is everywhere. Every country that now selects its officials by asking them to sit down at a desk and demonstrate that they know things, rather than by asking who their father was, is running, whether it knows it or not, a small quiet copy of an idea that was worked out in Chang'an, that a nobody who studies might govern. It is one of the best ideas anyone has ever had, and it was not ours, and we all took it. And on the lowest bluff above the Yellow River, in the soft yellow dust that blew off the deserts and lay down thousands of years deep, there is a farmer with a hoe. He was there before the Xia, if there was a Xia. He was there when the Shang were heating shoulder blades and reading the cracks. He was there when the first emperor's carts came through with their standardized axles fitting the standardized ruts. And he was there when the Tang camels came in from the west with the dust still on them. And he was there when the Mongol horses went over, and he was there when the Ming rebuilt the wall. And he is there now, in the last of the light, hoeing millet, having barely noticed which dynasty it is, because that was never really the point, and he has always known it. Everything else in this story was the weather over his field. History does not disappear, it just becomes the ground beneath our feet, and in his case, quite literally so, dug with a stick, soft as flour, and still growing millet. So the lamp, the one small oil lamp that was burning in the doorway of a mud-walled house on the bluff when we began 4,000 years ago, and that became, somewhere along the way, a single red paper lantern hanging under the eaves of a courtyard house. It is still there, in the doorway, above the river. The kings and the emperors have all gone past it. The bronze went past, and the chariots, and the silk carts, and the poets, and the horsemen, and the treasure ships that never came this far inland, and the telegraph wire, and the last small boy in his enormous palace, and the lantern did not notice any of them. It has one job. It is doing it. The paper is warm and faintly red, and moves a little when the air moves. Below the doorway, the river goes on making the low steady sound it has made since before there was anyone to hear it, carrying its endless quiet freight of yellow dust down out of the plateau and across the plain towards the sea, building its bed a little higher, as it always has, patient as anything, in no hurry whatsoever. Are you still awake? If you are, that is perfectly all right, and there is another long quiet story waiting for you on the screen when this one finishes. It will start on its own, and you do not have to do anything about it. And if you enjoyed walking all this way, all 4,000 years of it, only if you truly enjoyed it, you might leave a like, and you might subscribe, and it does help more than you would think. But you do not have to do that either. You do not have to do anything now. Let the small weight of the day slip the rest of the way off your shoulders. Let your breathing go long and slow, the way the river goes. The dynasties rose and ripened and tired and were replaced, and the land went on being the land. And it is all safely behind us. All of it. Finished. Nothing left to worry about, nothing left for you to hold. Close your eyes. The lantern in the doorway above the Yellow River is burning very low now. A small warm coal of light in all that soft dark, and the farmer has gone in, and the millet is drying on the roof. And the river is going on without us. And now, very gently, the light goes out. Good night and sweet dreams.